that football focus doing? Last week they had Brady. This week they got Brady.
We're literally doing it differently from everybody else.
As a matter of fact, moving forward from this point on, I will not make reference to PFF.
Ready to get into it?
Yeah.
All right. We're going team by team.
I would be very careful about slinging stuff.
Am I going to get sued?
We got legal on this?
Let's send you out on the right note. PFF sucks. Have a great day, everybody.
Wow.
Welcome into the PFF NFL podcast. Steve Palazzolo, Sam Monson, live on YouTube. Got a big show today here, Sam.
Big show.
We're going team by team. I don't know how long it's going to take. We're going team by team.
I have 9 hours knowing us.
Grading their offseason, all 32 NFL teams. But first, I want to talk a little bit about, the offseason is here. This is an offseason type of topic, and we want to make sure that the people have their voices heard if you have any good offseason topics for us leading up to training camp.
Yeah, now's the time for suggestions. So the email down there, NFLpodcast@pff.com is where to send us emails of things you would like to see us cover. One of the biggest shows we did last offseason was the crazy expansion draft where a listener, I forget the man's name right now, but he'd devised the whole idea, the rules, the whole thing, and we drafted expansion teams badly in my case.
And I think we could follow up on that.
Sure, yeah. We could do a kind of a next year, turn it into a dynasty expansion.
Yeah.
But also things like that. If you have an idea along those lines, fire them in, because apparently that was one of our biggest shows last night.
I don't love all the ideas. I mean, we have. Was it a user that sent in the periodic table of the quarterbacks a few years back? And we've done a whole lot of animal-based shows. Not my favorite topic.
Loser.
Comparing
the periodic table
players to animals.
Good. That was fun.
The periodic table was good. It was creative.
Yeah.
So, I mean, those types of things we can have some fun with.
Yeah. No, they're good. Some of them are good. You're right. Not every idea that comes in is a winner, but a lot of them are. So
we'll filter them out.
Yeah.
Also, we do have some PFF Plus subscriptions that we need to give out. I need to make sure that
for the bets. Yeah, that's your job this time.
I'll take care of that. So we'll follow up on that. If you guys didn't see Monday's show, it wasn't in the title, but Monday's show, we did go through all of the bets and predictions of our viewers and listeners and recapped who won and who lost. We were something like 2-27 with a couple pending, so a couple winners, 2 or 3 winners on Monday and a whole bunch of losers.
Yeah, we fared a lot better on that one than we did in the regular season bets.
Yeah, draft is tough.
Where we got wrecked. Geno Smith in particular. The Geno Smith and the Seahawks wrecked us last year.
Was that 2 years ago?
2 years ago, yeah. And then this year it was Jordan Love wrecking us.
All right. We got anything else we want to talk about here at the beginning?
No, I think that's it's going to be a long enough show as it is without delaying it even further.
All right. So this is over at PFF.com. 2024 offseason grades for all 32 NFL teams. Trevor did the work here, Trevor Sikkema, and we're going to go through, review what Trevor said, and also give our own take, maybe give our own grades on top of that. Disagree with Trevor, either way, right? So let's do it. We're going to do this one alphabetically, because that's how the article is too. So we're going to go Arizona Cardinals, number 1, and they had a B+ here from Trevor. Your thoughts on the Cardinals offseason, of course, recently highlighted by 2 first-round picks here, Marvin Harrison Jr. and Darius Robinson.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the big the big needle mover in this whole offseason. Free agency, they definitely added some bodies, and some of them should be useful additions. I don't know that they made much of a difference, to a team. Guys like Jonah Williams, who's been a sub-average / marginally capable starter at either offensive tackle spot in the last couple of years of the Bengals. Sean Murphy-Bunting wasn't good when he moved positions. Maybe if they move him back, that's where they get the best version of him. But ultimately, this offseason hinges on they got Marvin Harrison Jr. in particular with that 4th overall pick. And I've said this a bunch of times. If you were creating a position-agnostic big board, forget value, just who are the best players in this draft relative to everybody else, Marvin Harrison Jr. might have been the number 1 player in the draft. So you can look at this and say at number 4 overall, the Arizona Cardinals selected the best football player in the draft at what is probably the 2nd most valuable position in football, right? Quarterback, obviously the most valuable by a mile. If you're not in the quarterback market, a number 1 wide receiver might be the best you can do in terms of impact value. And they get this guy at number 4 overall. That obviously gives them a number 1 wide receiver. It also helps somebody like Michael Wilson take a step down the depth chart, as you always say, and therefore improve in a role lower down. And then I think the rest of that draft was pretty good as well, both in terms of fitting areas of need, Darius Robinson, Max Melton, but also particularly lower down the draft. They did that double and triple dipping at cornerback in particular, but a couple of positions, and maximize their chances of these guys having some kind of impact.
Yeah, 12 total draft picks for the Arizona Cardinals, including, as you said, doubling up, tripling up at corner, but two in particular, Elijah Jones and Max Melton, high upside type of cornerbacks to try to solve their secondary issues. Still a ways to go. I think the defensive line still needs a lot more. The secondary has a lot of question marks, but I think moving in the right direction, the Cardinals, and this is 2 years of building up to the Kyler Murray injury, allowing them to kind of reset last year, get some old contracts off the roster, get younger. And so I think the B+ is probably fair here for the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, let's go to the Atlanta Falcons.
Ooh.
Now, Trevor's going C- here for the Falcons. And I'm going to disagree strongly with this one. I thought that the Falcons signing Kirk Cousins, like that still happened. It still existed. And even though they did draft Michael Penix Jr. during the draft, again, we're not going to rehash that entire conversation, but I'm certainly more in favor of that move than maybe others. But the Kirk Cousins move, if we're just talking about who had a good offseason and who goes into 2024 probably as a better team here, I think the Falcons are there, right? We just had a most improved team show on Monday and mentioned the Falcons as one of those teams. And I'm trying not to fall into the thing that I hate here, Sam, which is you say, here's what last year's team did, and you change one thing on last year's team and you assume everything else is going to be the same and it's just going to get better. But I'm going to do that. They just changed the quarterback from Desmond Ridder to Kirk Cousins. Just that alone might be worth 2 or 3 wins for the Falcons, a team that was on the cusp of winning the NFC South last year. New coaching staff, of course. So there was some change in Atlanta, but I think just the Cousins move and some of the additions at playmaker, at receiver for them are moving the Falcons in the right direction.
Yeah, in order for you to say that the Atlanta Falcons had a C- offseason, you have to essentially view that the Michael Penix Jr. pick was just lighting a draft selection on fire.
Say it to his face, man. Say it to Trevor's face.
I'll call him.
This is Trevor's article.
Trevor, where's my solo shot? Where's my solo? Give it to me. Give it to me. Trevor, you are wrong and you're hating on the Falcons, and I've had enough of it. It ends now. There we go.
Thank you. That was good.
I think that's true. You have to basically view that is lighting a draft pick on fire. And okay, for the 2024 season, strictly speaking, it is, right? Michael Penix Jr. is ideally, he's not going to feature at all this season in their view, right? Now, he might because quarterbacks get injured and those kinds of things. So if he has any kind of impact this season, it wasn't lighting a draft pick on fire. And even if he doesn't, it's not a pick for this year. It's a pick for the future, which happens all the time in the draft, just not at quarterback when you've just signed a guy, right? It's the equivalent of teams drafting, a player at a position for next year. It happens regularly. So I think viewing that draft pick in those terms is wrong. And I agree with you. Like, they made the single biggest upgrade at quarterback in the entire offseason, right? Caleb Williams might end up being fantastic, but Caleb Williams in year one being better than the baseline for Kirk Cousins over the last 5 years or so is hitting one of the smallest percentiles of his range of outcomes, right? Him being a better quarterback this year than Kirk Cousins is very unlikely. Possible, but unlikely. So the chances are Atlanta made the single biggest upgrade at quarterback, the most important position in the league of any team in football. So if they've done that, to come out of this and say it's a C- offseason, I think is crazy.
Yeah, the things to watch for Atlanta, the offensive line, which looked pretty solid under Arthur Smith, and a very run-heavy system. They were very well protected. I'm not sure it's the best pass-blocking offensive line. Our friend Zach Robinson maybe has to work around some of those deficiencies, but love the addition of Darnell Mooney to complement Drake London, Kyle Pitts, of course, Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. Love what they have as far as skill positions on the offense. The question, and one that Trevor brought up, rightfully so, is the cornerback position opposite A.J. Terrell. That looks rough right now. Clark Phillips, the third coming in as in his second year. He's more of a slot. Is he the guy that they're leaning on? Natron Brooks, D. Alford, Antonio Hamilton, Mike Hughes. Those are the other cornerbacks that are all either a nickel or cornerback opposite A.J. Terrell. Kevin King is on the roster battling for a spot. So that's a massive weakness. But I'll say this, Stephon Gilmore's still out there, right? Like
a lot of guys, yeah. They'd be an intriguing team for one of those. Now we've passed the point where any free agent signing counts against the compensatory draft pick formula. So that's why you're seeing, I mean, Jerry Jacobs is just taking a visit to Minnesota and Atlanta, I think, actually, or the two teams he's visiting. So guys like Jerry Jacobs, I mean, there's a bunch of these guys that are still available that absolutely make sense. Like, I would be very surprised if Atlanta went into the season with their number 2 cornerback currently on the roster.
So that's what they still need. But to this point, again, I think the biggest thing was they got Cousins, and I liked it at the time, not because Kirk Cousins is necessarily bringing a Super Bowl to Atlanta, but I think they're going to be much improved, give themselves a chance to get into the playoffs, make a playoff run. And at the time, I liked it because they didn't have to force a quarterback pick. Hey, they took a quarterback anyway, but I didn't hate what the Falcons did this offseason.
Same. I think if you view Kirk Cousins as the single biggest quarterback upgrade that any team made this offseason, you can't start off with a C-.
As a busy parent, you want to give your kids a head start in their financial future, but investing can often be both confusing and time-consuming. So Fabric by Gerber Life makes it easy for you to set up an investment account for your child that grows with them and helps prepare for their financial future. Picture a future where your child has the financial freedom to pursue their dreams without any barriers with a UGMA account from Fabric by Gerber Life. It's a real possibility because of the simple but impactful actions that you can take today. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy for you to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a UGMA account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. UGMA stands for Uniform Gifts to Minors Act. So while your kids can invest while they're minors, a UGMA account allows you to invest on their behalf and gives their investments more time to grow. So join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. That's meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. Portfolio is managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. and additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Monthly minimum contribution required. Learn more at meetfabric.com. All right, we're on to the Baltimore Ravens. Trevor goes B+ for the Ravens. Biggest moves here. Justin Madubuike coming off of a career year. He's re-signed and back on the defensive line for Baltimore. But they also lose linebacker Patrick Queen, safety Geno Stone, two guys also coming off of career years. The offensive line overhaul as well. Morgan Moses traded, Kevin Zeitler out, John Simpson out. So there's a little bit more, I think, uneasiness or uncertainty on the offensive line here for Baltimore.
Yeah, I mean, they sort of voluntarily destroyed that offensive line, like tore it apart in the offseason. And okay, they've done a reasonable job of building it back up. They've made some additions and added some players, but it still feels like some turnover that is arguably going to make it worse. Now, you bring in potential players that can offset that across the board, not just on the offensive line, but like adding somebody like Derrick Henry to the backfield makes that interesting. The whole offense generally, they're the next team that added Josh Jones. The poor guy can't seem to find a starting gig anywhere, despite looking like a pretty quality left tackle and not a quality anything else. So that will be like Ronnie Stanley is a bit of an injury question mark at this point. I guess Josh Jones has a chance at some point to take that step, but yeah, it's been a good offseason, I think, for Baltimore, with the one question mark of why they were sort of so keen on attacking that offensive line from a negative point of view before they rebuilt it.
Yeah, I mean, they're probably going to rely on Rosengarten to play right tackle, Ben Cleveland in at guard, and Tyler Linderbaum and Ronnie Stanley. Those guys all look fine. Patrick McCarry has played both guard and filled in at tackle if he has to. Like, he's kind of the wild card that can fill multiple roles there. I don't think it's going to be a disaster or anything, but they lost, again, some certainty. And, you know, there's some studies out there about the continuity of offensive line. So you're going to lose some of that continuity in Baltimore. Bringing Madubuike back, I mean, even if you just look at their roster, I think the Ravens roster, just in PFF terms, if you go to PFF.com and you look at the depth chart and you look at just the grades, and it's a sea of green. Like, it's a whole bunch of solid players. The other question here, and if you want to factor this in, is you lose Mike McDonald as defensive coordinator. The whole coaching staff and front office was gutted. I'm not saying that necessarily needs to come into play here, but that's a big challenge for Baltimore, right? We've seen very good teams through the years, when you hit on something, Seattle's cover 3 scheme, or you just have a really good consistent run as a front office, you have to figure out how to do it with new people, right? With churn. This is the first year Baltimore's really had significant churn in multiple parts of the organization. So that's the other thing I think to keep an eye on, more so than even just the on-field moves.
Yeah. The front office changing probably doesn't have a huge effect this year, but the loss of Mike Macdonald could have. Mike Macdonald, their defense coordinator, goes on to become the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks. Now they've promoted from within, so theoretically that's the right approach, I think, in terms of continuity, right? Keeping what's been working. But, Mike Macdonald is, if Vic Fangio's defense was the system du jour for the last couple of years, Mike Macdonald seems to be going that way now, right? There's now 4 or 5 teams that are going to be running some variant of Mike Macdonald's defense, which obviously itself traces back even further. But he was the guy, like Vic Fangio, who seemed to have it cooking the best, right? And there was a really interesting piece in The Athletic by
Ted Wynn.
Is he a friend of the show? Have we had him on the show? Or
Ted? No, we've never.
Friends in person.
Not a friend. Of the show, as in he's been on the show.
Right.
Friendly with the show.
Correct. Anyway, Ted's article was a really good article about Mike Macdonald and his defense and what are the characteristics of it, because it's not like some other defenses where, the whole scheme is radically different. What he essentially articulates Mike Macdonald's defense as being as the differentiator with his defense is the way he teaches it, right? So it's not fundamentally different from a lot of other defenses, except the way they teach it is fundamentally different. So he essentially he teaches pressure packages, right? And they're sort of independent from the defensive front and the coverages, so that once you understand the pressure package, you can effectively swap players in and out, regardless of position, and run the same pressure package. Doesn't matter what the front is. Right. And that means that the Ravens defense, and presumably now Seattle's defense, they're able to play so much faster and look way more multiple than they actually are, because you can't get a bead on what pressure package they're going to bring based on the front you're seeing, because they can do it from any front. And that's what makes them so good at being able to do this, that players are able to learn it in a slightly different way, understand what everybody else is doing, and therefore know that regardless of the front or the coverage you're running, if they call this specific pressure, that's what everybody's doing. So anyway, the point being, he's the guy that's sort of invented this way of doing it, that's distilled this way. He's the Vic Fangio of this defensive system. Now with the loss of him, is his replacement able to just step in and keep the lights on, everything goes fine? Or do you lose something with the pioneer of that system leaving town?
So, it has to be discussed as part of Zach Orr is going to be the defensive coordinator for the Ravens. It's part of this discussion here, right, as far as the Ravens offseason, not just players, but coaches as well. So B+ from Trevor there for the Ravens. I think somewhere in the B range is fine, but if you add in some of the other losses, it's probably closer to if you want to call it the C range, just because, again, we're looking at uncertainty. And I think when we're grading off seasons, we're kind of weighing how much certainty do we have, how much uncertainty. It doesn't mean that younger players won't work or whatever it might be. It's less comfortable. And speaking of, Buffalo Bills. C+ for the Buffalo Bills.
Thought you were going to go into my twitching bicep, because that's quite uncomfortable.
We're not. Listen, we got to stay on point here. We're not going to talk about you being in your 40s. So Buffalo Bills, Trevor's going C+ here. And, it's a fascinating offseason because, just look at the list on the screen if you're on YouTube. Released Jordan Poyer and Mitch Morse and Naheem Hines, Deontay Hardy, released Tre'Davious White.
A lot of turnover.
Yes, there's a lot of turnover. But at the same time, we've seen, in the history of the NFL, especially in the salary cap era, you used to see this all the time where teams lost veterans and just trusted their young players. I think Minnesota did a little bit of this last year. And if Minnesota didn't have their quarterback issue, Kirk Cousins getting hurt, it may not have affected them all that much. So what are your thoughts on the Bills and just getting younger on both sides of the ball?
Yeah, so I struggle to sort of find a really positive spin on their wide receiver situation, which again has had a ton of turnover. it is a fair point to make that, like, okay, look at what was available to them. What would you have had them do? Like, what was the optimal strategy here, right? Because that's sort of what you hear analytics people and generally second-guessing moves that NFL front offices make, et cetera, et cetera.
Just the ones that were made, right?
Right, and usually, so it's like, what was the optimal strategy here? And it's done in abstract terms. And, a lot of the time you don't actually look at the players available. And I think it's fair to say, look, if you had a wide receiver problem this offseason, it was a bad year for that to be the case, particularly if you needed a number one X wide receiver, right? And you were drafting where the Bills were drafting, i.e. you didn't have a chance at Marvin Harrison Jr. or Malik Neighbors or one of those guys. So from that point of view, I think it's a fair point to say, look, Buffalo has made a bunch of sort of slightly strange moves at wide receiver, but what would you have had them do instead, right? Because nobody traded for Brandon Ayuk. You can take that to mean nobody offered, or simply that he wasn't available, right? If you assume that Brandon Ayuk or T. Higgins or whatever were not available to Buffalo, Michael Pittman Jr. never hit the open market, neither did Mike Evans. The options out there to have just replaced Stephon Diggs and said, we're good, we're not great, right? Similarly, in the draft, once you got down to the low 20s, the three guys that everyone thought were superstars were gone, and everyone else, there's a question mark of some variety, right? And Keon Coleman ends up being the guy they settle on. However, the Stephon Diggs thing was a move of their own making. They could have just kept him, right? Now, maybe he would have been a pain in the ass, and that's its own thing, but they chose to trade away a legitimate outside X wide receiver and not have a ready-made replacement for him available. And what we are seeing is the inevitable outcome of that, which is they've struggled to replace him, and that does look to be a hole in this offense. And I'm a little bit scared of them articulating that Keon Coleman's going to get the first chance to fix that, because it doesn't seem like what he's best suited to do, nor is it what Khalil Shakir is best suited to do, nor is it what Curtis Samuel is best suited to do, or, Dalton Kincaid or any of those guys, right? And now Marquez Valdes-Scantling comes in. And somebody pointed out yesterday, he's now, in his NFL career, his quarterbacks have been Aaron Rodgers, Patrick Mahomes, and now Josh Allen.
I pointed it out. He is a 3-time MVP creator and a 2-time Super Bowl champion. In 2020 and 21, he had MVP Aaron Rodgers, 22 MVP and Super Bowl champion Mahomes, 23 Super Bowl champion.
Well, the other way of looking
Josh
at that,
Allen, and then you say 2024, Josh Allen, question mark.
Yeah. The other way of looking at that is, with the quarterbacks that have thrown the football in the direction of MVS, how have his statistics and production been as bad as they have been?
Because he's a pure deep threat with bad hands.
Right. So this is my point, right? Is you're adding this guy and you're like, okay, he can actually do some of the things that you're questioning the other guys on this roster, whether they have the capability of doing that. He, however, can't do much else.
I mean, they signed
all
him,
he can do is win against press coverage outside and get deep.
They signed him for like $2 million to be wide receiver
But that's my
4/5.
Well, yeah, but not so much that. They've signed him because he's a guy that can play outside, defeat press coverage, and beat man coverage down the field, which a lot of these other guys don't seem like they necessarily can do. And you're like, okay, that's stylistically, that's a good fit. That's adding the missing component, but it's adding the missing component from a player that's proven he can't make a big impact overall on the team. So the overall sense here is this receiving core is probably worse than it was heading into last year.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely worse. I mean, they lost Gabe Davis, had essentially a wide receiver need.
Right.
They bring in a Curtis Samuel, but you still have an outside wide receiver need before they traded Stephon Diggs.
Yes.
I guess what I'm interested in now for the Bills is to make this all work. Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel, and Keon Coleman, all really good after the catch type of guys. Dalton Kincaid, a really good short area after the catch type of guy. James Cook out of the backfield. There were points last season, including in the Chiefs game. Remember, they ran a very good game plan against the Chiefs. Control the ball, control the clock, the thing that you would encourage a team to do. The Bills were just so depleted on the defensive side of the ball. This was in the playoff game, I believe, or maybe in the regular season game. They're so in the playoff game. They were so depleted on the defensive side of the ball they couldn't make a stop against the Chiefs. So I'm curious how much the Bills are going to go to this take pressure off of Josh Allen.
Yeah.
And then, because we say this every year, right? You can't just let him be Superman from week 1 through 17 nonstop. How much of it's going to be a little bit more run game, a little bit more yak centered? It's a full year of Joe Brady as offensive coordinator, and they're putting those pieces in place. So it doesn't again, on paper, it doesn't feel great because at some point you're still going to be in 3rd and 10, and you want Stephon Diggs, caliber receiver, to get open, and Josh Allen to get him the ball.
Yeah, that's the one thing that can possibly ameliorate some of this problematic roster construction. Yes, is not a word you're familiar with. Is if they fundamentally change the way this offense works, which, they might this year because, as you said, first full year of Joe Brady, it's going to be his offense, not whatever version of the previous offense he was able to cobble together live on the fly last season. So if you look at this and say, all right, we don't have a Stephon Diggs anymore, we don't even have a Gabe Davis anymore, but we have a bunch of guys that are all slot options or yak guys, maybe we can create a different type of offense where they all look better. The other thing is, they've done a little bit of what we preach in terms of they've thrown a lot of darts at this thing, right? Now, you look at the darts they've thrown, right? It doesn't really feel like there's a winning dart in there necessarily.
That receiver?
Yeah. But, just guys that have been added, right? Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Keon Coleman, Mac Hollins, Chase Claypool was another guy that they signed randomly between the draft and now. They have thrown a lot of darts at this thing.
Guys that I liked 4 or 5 years ago,
right.
Too, yeah.
And you're like, it's sort of like, remember the Colts a few years ago where Colts fans were painting this picture where every one of these high risk, high risk, deep odds, outside chance guys all hit the high end of their range of outcomes. You're like, if all that happens, this is a good receiving core. It's like this, right? If all of these crazy darts that they've thrown hit, it's fine. But even if one of them hits, they're in a good spot.
It just doesn't always work out for receiving cores. It works better for offensive
well,
linemen.
The problem is if you need more than one to hit, it's not going to happen.
A lot of the quote-unquote big-name players, the Tre'Davious Whites and Mitch Morses of the world, they have replacements in-house or guys that got to play when they were hurt. So it's probably not going to be as bad as it feels here during the offseason for the Bills.
And, if no other reason than Josh Allen is the quarterback.
And Josh Allen. Yeah, of course. All right, Carolina Panthers. Trevor's going C+ here for the Panthers. And, look, I think directionally they're getting better here. They had, new coaching staff, new turnover here. Dave Canales comes in from Tampa Bay. Canales is going to be just a fascinating story watching him with Bryce Young. We've seen Canales as part of Geno Smith getting his career on track and becoming a viable starter for the Seattle Seahawks. And we've seen Canales as the architect of Baker Mayfield's best season as a pro last year and making a little run in the playoffs with the Bucs. So can he do the same with Bryce Young? That's going to – and did the Panthers do enough loading up on, some interior offensive linemen, spending a ton at guard on Robert Hunt and Damian Lewis, trading for Deontay Johnson at wide receiver? And, is that enough for the Panthers to take a big step forward here?
Yeah, I think you can give them some credit for this offseason. You can see the plan. Whether or not they've successfully executed the plan, that remains to be seen. But they invested heavily in the interior of that offensive line. Damian Lewis, Robert Hunt were big swings of the bat. And this offensive line didn't look like it was going to be as bad as it was last season. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
When you looked at this group on paper heading into last year, you weren't immediately looking at it and saying, wow, this team, people had problems with the Jets offensive line before they went into the year, right? That was being held up as that might be the thing that stops Aaron Rodgers doing what Aaron Rodgers wants to do with the Jets and win a championship. And ended up, 5 plays in, Rodgers is down. Now it's a complete catastrophe. We weren't saying that about the Panthers offensive line. It didn't look great, but it didn't look like this is going to be an absolute Achilles heel, pardon the pun, of this offense. So, Taylor Moton is a really good right tackle. Robert Hunt is a good player as a starter. Damian Lewis is a fine starting player. Ike Ekwonu took a huge step backward last year. He shouldn't have been that bad. And Austin Corbett has decent play in his past. So this is a group that should be able to play at a half-decent level if everything else is functioning. Now you get into this symbiotic relationship between the offensive line and the receivers. Receivers last year were terrible. So what have they done to improve that? Well, Deontay Johnson is a guy that can separate and be open consistently, and therefore the quarterback should have somewhere to go with the ball earlier in the play than he did last year. Xavier Legette coming in as well should make a big difference because that's a skill set that wasn't really there in terms of blazing speed and contested catch skills. So I think you look at that and the combination of they got rid of a coaching staff that wasn't working, right? Whether it would have pulled it back around is hard to say, but it was a functional catastrophe last year. Dave Canales did great things with Baker Mayfield and Tampa Bay. So those things, right? Offensive line's rebuilt pretty well. Wide receivers has had a lot of work done to it. Jonathan Brooks in the backfield is an addition as well. And then the change in coaching staff. I think that alone makes it a pretty good offseason.
Yeah, I'm curious what Dr. Eager thinks of the heavy investment at guard, $20 million APY for Robert Hunt and $13.5 for Damian Lewis. But either way, it's a creep back toward average type of offensive line, which is a good starting point, at least for this year, to see what Bryce Young can do. And, Deontay Johnson giving another option with Adam Thielen. Remember, every third and 4+, it's like Adam Thielen or bust last year for the Panthers. And just having someone else who can get open. And look, say what you want about the running back value. I think Jonathan Brooks was the best running back in the draft once he's back healthy from injury, at least top 2 running back in the draft.
Right.
So they've got some playmakers there to give Bryce Young some options. Jadeveon Clowney coming in on the defensive side of the ball. Derek Brown got re-signed this offseason. So I think it's solid, the roster getting better, and it all come down to Bryce Young improving on a 56 PFF grade and really one of the worst rookie seasons that we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, I think they've done a lot of work on the offense. Now, the problem is that that's offset to a degree by losses on the defensive side, which isn't great. Like Brian Burns, they ended up essentially cutting bait on that, having made a bit of a mess of keeping him long term. That's not great. But
I honestly have been in the Burns is a little overrated.
I think he is.
Camp anyway, so I don't mind that moving on.
But it's still a significant loss. And when you consider, when you put it in the context of they could have had multiple.
Yeah,
firsts.
I mean, if you look at it from a multi-year view, in the Panthers, the organization could have had 2 firsts theoretically from the Rams the previous year. That's not great.
Right. So, and it's a loss given what's remaining at that spot.
Which reminds me that the investment that the Rams have wanted to make in Florida State defensive linemen in particular. They were trying to get Burns for multiple firsts. They traded basically gave up 2 2s for Braden Fisk, used one of the picks, traded a new one, and Jared Verse in the draft.
So that's a loss, but I think it's way more important to fix the offensive side and try and rescue the career of Bryce Young than it is to do anything on the defensive side of the ball.
All right, we're going alphabetically through every single team here. It's going to take all day, but we're here. We're here for you. Offseason grades for every NFL team. Chicago Bears are up next. Trevor's giving them an A. It's hard to disagree with A for the Chicago Bears. There is a new kind of hope in Chicago. Starts with Caleb Williams at quarterback, but that's not it. It's not just, hey, we have a new quarterback. The supporting cast that Caleb Williams has looks much better than what the last first-round quarterback had to work with.
Yeah, it doesn't just look. I mean, it is much better. Inarguably, it is significantly better. It is, it's hope for the first time since the last hope that they had in Justin Fields. And then the last one before that in Mitchell Trubisky. And then, anyway. It's I mean, if we said Kirk Cousins is probably the single biggest quarterback upgrade that's been made this offseason, the only other one that you could argue is Caleb Williams, I think, who definitely has the potential to be better than Kirk Cousins. I don't think it's likely year one just because of the way, history tells you it's not likely that as a rookie he's better than Kirk Cousins. But we talk about this guy as having special within his range of outcomes. And not just, the 99.9th percentile. Maybe there's something that could be there that exists for most of these guys, but special fairly firmly within his range of outcomes based off his college tape and his production and performance. So you've gotten this guy number 1 overall. And there is a difference between you got the number 1 overall pick, not Justin Fields, who was QB4, right, that year, and pick number 11 or whatever. There's a difference in that. However, even if Justin Fields previously was seen as maybe 1A in that draft class, it is fundamentally different to be picking the number 1 guy that everyone kind of agrees on. So getting him, adding Roma Dunze, keeping Jalen Johnson in what was a fairly team-friendly deal, and then, tinkering around the edges, getting a couple of other players. Keenan Allen should be a real needle mover in terms of helping Caleb Williams transition. It's hard not to like what the Chicago Bears did this offseason. Yeah,
one of the ways to my heart, Sam, is to sign a receiver like Keenan Allen, have a really nice 1-2 punch like DJ Moore and Keenan Allen going into the draft, and still drafting another wide receiver because Roma Dunze, probably the best player on the board at pick 9. So now you've got that trio. And you also have, hey, look, Keenan Allen's had this injury history, but you have a whole, 3 unique skill sets at receiver where Keenan Allen can work the slot, the whole underneath game. Roma Dunze as a vertical threat. DJ Moore can do a little bit of everything. And I think a Dunze at some point can do everything as well. So I think that is really encouraging for the Bears, giving that weapon to Caleb Williams. And then, you mentioned Jalen Johnson coming back. Montez Sweat was not really an off-season move. That was an in-season move. But you've got some playmakers that they needed to get on that defensive side of the ball now.
The fascinating counterfactual is just gaming out if they had gone, because this was all based off right at the start of the preseason. You got to make the call, right? Do you stick with Justin Fields and build around him, or do you go with Caleb Williams and trade away Justin Fields and reset? And they obviously elected to do the latter. It would be interesting to sort of game out what could they have done if they'd decided, let's give Fields the chance that we didn't give him earlier in his career. We get Keenan Allen, same thing. We don't need to change that. But if they'd taken that number 1 pick and traded down with somebody, right? What could they have built with the current draft, with the future picks, with Justin Fields there? Like, what would that look like? Because it would be pretty, like you got a hell of a trade for that.
We're trying to talk about a Bears offseason here, and you're thinking counterfactuals here.
Well, I think just it might be, both of them might have been A's, right? If they'd done that counterfactual, it might still be an A offseason. It just would have been different. I think, this is when you have the number 1 overall pick and a pick in the top 10 later on, and, you're probably going to do well because the chances are you're upgrading in a significant way, some way.
But either way, the Bears also played well down the stretch for Matt Eberflus, who comes back. That
saved his job.
He did. He saved his job. That is one of the things to keep an eye on. There's not a great history of the quarterback, the coach who is fighting for his job, and then they're going to pick a new quarterback. And this was like Jeff Fisher with the Rams had 1 year of Jared Goff, and in Chicago, John Fox had 1 year of Mitch Trubisky. So there's not a great history of that. You could argue maybe Zach Taylor with the Bengals wasn't doing great until he had Joe Burrow, and that propelled Zach Taylor. So we'll see what happens with that whole dynamic. But they've decided to stay with Eberflus and see what they can do with Caleb Williams. But I think you got to be excited. If you're a Bears fan, I'm mostly excited because I think the offensive line too, not as bad as it seemed. I don't think it's great, but it's not as bad as it seemed, and I think it's good enough to get the ball to those playmakers that they have there.
Yep.
All right, let's go to the Cincinnati Bengals. Trevor's going A for the Bengals. A couple of the moves making that work here. T. Higgins is still on the roster, so that's a thing. I think either way, with a player as good as Higgins, whether you're going to have him for 1 more year, lock him up long term, trade him for a high draft pick, there's a lot of good that can come out of just having T. Higgins and developing him as a top receiver. They're going to lose DJ Reader on the defensive line, but you bring in Trent Brown to play right tackle, Geno Stone at safety. Von Bell comes back at safety. It feels like they handled a position that they struggled at last year at safety. Mike Gesicki at tight end. And I really liked what they did in the draft with Amarius Mims, Chris Jenkins Jr., and then, of course, wide receiver Jermaine Burton.
Yeah, it is, however, so part of this is like you look at where they were coming out of the season, where they are right now, because you lose guys like DJ Reader. Like, they've done a really good job of backfilling and replacing what you lost in DJ Reader. You did, however, lose DJ Reader, and therefore, you sort of look at all their moves, and they're doing good jobs of getting contingency and like backfilling losses, but they almost all are replacing losses of some description. So even Burton comes in, it's like, well, you lost Tyler Boyd. Like, it's a loss. So I don't know if I can. And A feels generous to this offseason because I think almost it's like ignoring the departures and just focusing on how well they've done at replacing them.
I think those departures are expected, though, when we've talked about teams like the Bengals and the Bills.
But it's like Buffalo, right? Like, you could have done something different. You could have kept Stephon Diggs or Gabe Davis. Instead, you're like, no, we're moving on. And it might be the right decision to move on.
But when you have so much money locked up in the quarterbacks, and there's the handful of teams, the Bengals, the Bills, the Chiefs, the teams that have this long-term quarterback contract, that people are going to be out the door, right? Your second tier of free agents. And they have to say, we can't pay Trey Hendrickson and a DJ Reader on the defensive side of the ball. We have to choose one, so we need to have that contingency. We need to get younger at certain positions, and I think the Bengals have done a really good job of that.
It's the reality of the situation when you have a quarterback in particular on that much money, but you still have to sort of look at it in honest terms and say, are they better or worse at each given spot? And certainly in some positions they're worse than they were previously. And to me that means you can't give them an A for it just because they've put a body in that spot.
I mean, the Trent Brown move, I think, helped a lot where they could get 1 year out of him and get Amarius Mims as your upside tackle. I loved Chris Jenkins as a second-round pick. Again, there's no one-to-one DJ Reader replacement,
right?
But Jenkins is a playmaker on that defensive line. You know how I feel about Jermaine Burton. I'm not concerned about Tyler Boyd for the Bengals because of what I think Burton can do immediately. He had a 60-yard touchdown at camp.
Against Air?
But it was 60 yards. Mm-hmm. And you could tell they're going to feature him because they threw it to him, and there was a video online.
Yeah.
So that he's going to be a hit.
I think actually there were 2 videos.
Yeah, there was multiple.
Like multiple.
Just saying. The hype is real.
Yeah.
I can't wait. I'm going to go to every training camp this year.
You should.
Go.
Just live tweet everything Jermaine Burton does.
That's what I'm going to do.
All camp.
That's what I'm going to do. Because he's going to be uncoverable.
Yeah.
So, I think the safety position, too, I don't think we can gloss over that, right? They lost Jesse Bates last year and Von Bell, and you could tell communication, flexibility defensively, a lot of things weren't there. Even though Jordan Battle, I think, played pretty well as a rookie, you just didn't get the same the expected play out of a guy like Dax Hill. They're going to move Dax Hill around now, maybe play more corner. He did a good job covering tight ends. There's flexibility on the defensive side of the ball now because you have Geno Stone and then Von Bell coming back. So I think they handled a lot of their questions and weaknesses, even though, you lose some veterans in DJ Reader and Tyler Boyd.
Yeah,
and Jonah Williams.
I mean, I think you give them credit. I think they've done a good job of replacing the gaps that were created on this roster. They did, however, create those gaps on the roster, and I'm not sure that they are significantly better at most of those spots. Trent Brown should be better than Jonah Williams on the offensive line, and Amarius Mims is now a contingency plan there as well. That's a good thing, but they're not even close to replacing DJ Reader because there basically is no replacement for a guy like DJ Reader. Certainly not without investing massively in that position. Tyler Boyd and Jermaine Burton might be fine, might be a positive. They might be better at that spot. Joe Mixon to Zach Moss, maybe that's a wash, but I don't see A in this. Like when you look at, there are teams that we're talking about, they're getting A off seasons because they've improved dramatically. I'm not 100% clear the Bengals are better than they were, 4 months ago.
I think you need to grade on the curve of, do you have a ton of money invested in the quarterback or do you not? And so the Bengals, the Bills, the Chiefs, every year, the Lions now, I mean, every year they're not going to be able to keep.
But the Lions got better.
Yeah, because they have a buffer year here with Goff's contract. That's going to be more challenging in the coming years. They can't just fill every need going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I just think there are teams that, even with that as the curve, you still have to, I think, if in order to get an A as an offseason, it feels like you need to be quite clearly better than you were at this point previously, and I don't think that they are.
I'll call it an A-. All right, Cleveland Browns. Trevor's going B- here for the Browns. Biggest move was trading for Jerry Jeudy from the Denver Broncos. Not a lot of other big moves, and also one of those drafts where they didn't have a first-round pick. They had a second, didn't pick a ton. So one of the drafts that I think didn't grade very highly, didn't look like it brought in a ton of impact players just because they didn't have the draft capital this year. But bring in Jameis Winston, though, too, as contingency at the quarterback position.
What a fascinating quarterback room that is, Dan.
Deshaun Watson, Jameis Winston, Tyler Huntley, and Dorian Thompson-Robinson.
Yeah, bringing back Zadarius Smith is, one of their most significant moves this offseason. I think that's a big deal for them. But, yeah, they had done most of the work already, and this was about kind of just keeping it going. They didn't actually have to do anything wild and crazy this offseason. So, yeah, I don't have an awful lot. What's interesting is that they didn't attack running back in a fairly hard way, like after Nick Chubb's catastrophic injury, just tearing his knee to shreds. They've kind of forced him to take a pay cut, but they haven't necessarily gone out and said, all right, what if Nick Chubb is never the same again? Do we need another guy? Now they've got guys on the roster already. Jerome Ford, Deontay Foreman is definitely a viable option to get a lot of carries or a big workload if Nick Chubb isn't the same guy. But they didn't prioritize that and say, we need to go get another, high-end running back from somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, we've said this a lot about the Browns. Most of the roster looks pretty good, right? They didn't have to make a ton of splash moves. And look, say what you want about Amari Cooper. I think he's been a very good player for the majority of his career. And say what you want about Jerry Jeudy. It's the they had to pay him, right? They got to pay Judy some money. But getting both of those receivers for mid-round draft picks, basically, I love those as moves. I'm not – the Cooper move obviously wasn't this year, but I do like that as a strategy that the Browns have employed. We're talking about how the Bills are struggling to replace Stephon Diggs and putting all their eggs in the Keon Coleman basket, and how, that there's some boom or bust to that. Well, the Browns are finding some pretty good receivers, or at least receivers with high-end potential. I don't think Judy has gotten close to the potential, certainly not that the NFL thought or that you and I thought that he might have coming out. But he's still shown those flashes as a very good route runner, a guy who can get open and can make some plays and be a complementary piece to Amari Cooper. And you're getting him for pennies on the dollar from a draft capital standpoint, even though, yes, you have to invest, actual cash for him. Offensive line looks good again for the Browns. I think, for the future, figuring out left tackle, is DeJuan Jones ever going to move over there? Probably not. So that's going to be next offseason. Do they have a left tackle replacement for Jedrick Wills when his contract runs out? Probably not on the roster, but everything else looks pretty solid, top to bottom. Didn't have to do a ton. With their second-round pick, getting Michael Hall from Ohio State just adds more depth to that defensive line, and we know how good that defensive line was last year and all the pieces that they added around Myles Garrett. So, yeah, I think you should feel pretty good about where the Browns are right now, and like other teams, it depends on what happens at the quarterback position.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, that's everything for them. And, I mean, you said Jameis Winston coming in as a backup there. It's not like they can do much at the quarterback position. You can't even sort of go, well, what if he doesn't play well this year? Because you're stuck with him.
Jameis gives you that Flacco run potential.
Yeah. But my point being, you can, they couldn't have done anything radical at the quarterback position because of the contract they've signed with Deshaun Watson. Like, they have tied themselves to him with that fully guaranteed deal. It's not like they could have even done anything crazy and sort of built this contingency. It's like, no, we are stuck with Deshaun Watson. Let's bring in Jameis so that if, he goes down and gets hurt, we have a better situation. But he has to be the guy.
All right, let's go to the Dallas Cowboys, a C+ from Trevor here. And, yeah, I mean, last year it felt like the Cowboys did a little better job in the offseason filling some of their needs. There's still time. There's still veterans out there. But Eric Kendricks comes in at linebacker essentially to replace Leighton Vander Esch, gets reunited with Mike Zimmer, who takes over as defensive coordinator. Bring back Jordan Lewis at corner. You lose Michael Gallup at receiver. He's been released. Vander Esch is going to retire. So not a ton of movement for the Cowboys. And then from a draft perspective, they went into the draft with legit needs at center and left tackle. They drafted players to replace, or to at least fill both spots. Tyler Guyton from Oklahoma, first-round pick, moving from right tackle to left tackle. I think he needs some work. And then Cooper Beebe, the guard out of Kansas State, looking like he's going to get the first crack to play center. So there are some question marks at 2 of your 5 offensive line spots. And the receiving core, which I was asked to rank recently, CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, you lose a Gallup, you've got a whole bunch of players looking for wide receiver 3. It doesn't look like it's certainly not better than it was last year.
Well, so this feels a lot like Cincinnati's offseason, except we prefer the players that Cincinnati selected to fill the gaps that they voluntarily created than we do for Dallas, right?
No, I think there's a lot of differences.
Why?
Because Dallas is relying on a first-round draft pick to play left tackle. The Bengals found a veteran to play right tackle in Trent Brown. The Bengals wide receiver 3 is Tyler Boyd.
Right.
But it's their wide receiver 3. They have other guys on the roster who are probably better than what Dallas has already. And they already have Higgins and Chase, right? Dallas is CeeDee Lamb, fine, call that a wash. And then Brandon Cooks.
Who's good.
It's just not as good. Like the need at receiver was greater for Dallas. I mean, I like Jermaine Burton better than I like
either way.
Jalen Tolbert and Racey McMath and
they've each lost wide receiver 3 for the offense. They've each lost an offensive tackle. They've each lost a running back. Like it's the same thing.
You're wrong, dude. I mean, their running back replacement in Dallas is year 10 of Zeke Elliott.
Yeah. Versus
Zach Moss with the Bengals.
Right? Either way, it's an unexciting addition to running back. Like the difference really is that Dallas relies on the rookie that they drafted in the first round as opposed to having a veteran in place as well. But the point being, the Cincinnati Bengals got given an A for their offseason. The Dallas Cowboys got given a C+, when both offseasons have been about backfilling the spots, the losses that they've incurred. Dallas lost Tyron Smith, Tyler Biadasz, Tony Pollard, Dorrance Armstrong, Leighton Vander Esch, and they've done a good job of replacing them. We just don't like the players as much.
The Bengals have lost. So the Bengals had to replace wide receiver 3 and defensive tackle, starting defensive tackle.
And offensive tackle.
And they did it with Trent Brown.
Right. So they've
the Cowboys are trying to replace 2 offensive line starters,
which they've done,
with draft picks rather than veterans where you already have an idea of what Trent Brown is.
This is what I'm saying.
That's a big difference, Sam.
They've each targeted guys to come in and replace the player. Like you're
it's a big difference.
You're bigging up the Chris Jenkins edition. That's a draft pick to replace an all-pro caliber nose tackle.
It's not even a like for like.
Exactly, because they don't have one. Like, this is exactly the same story. They've each targeted players to replace the losses in the offseason, but because we don't like the way that Dallas has done it as much, they get a C+, whereas the Bengals get an A.
No, because with the Cowboys, it's 2 offensive line positions where there's only 5 starters, and you don't have a rotation. Replacing a defensive lineman, it's easier to do that with a rotation, with multiple players, than 2/5 of your offensive line you're relying on a first and third round rookie, as Dallas has. If the Bengals were replacing, if they didn't sign Trent Brown and it was just Amarius Mims replacing him at right tackle, coming in and say, hey, Amarius Mims with 800 career college snaps, go play right tackle, protect Joe Burrow's front side. That's different.
That takes it from an A to a C+.
Yep. Yeah, and the players do matter. Of course, the players do matter.
Yeah, but it's not like we don't like the players that Dallas have added.
I don't think Tyler Guyton's ready to play in the NFL. He's going to be playing left tackle for the Dallas Cowboys with their Super Bowl aspirations. I could be wrong.
Maybe. Like we didn't think that about matters. Yeah, we didn't think that about Tyler Smith either, and he was
I did think that about Tyler Smith. You're wrong. He graded great and projected well at the NFL level.
He graded great as a run blocker. He
projected well, projected fine at the NFL level, and he got hidden at guard for half the season.
Hidden at guard?
He got to play guard half the season.
I don't think that's
more natural position.
Hidden. How is it? Okay.
Tyler Smith's a guard, man.
I mean, he is now. People were not necessarily saying that when he came into the NFL. He was just seen as a project left tackle because he was a run-blocking monster at Tulsa, and his pass protection was average at best, and he needed to be rebuilt. And then the Cowboys drafted him, said he's a guard, and now because he's really good at guard, we're like, he was always a guard.
In addition to all the players that the Cowboys lost are better than the players that the Bengals lost, other than maybe Reeder. Gallup
certainly
versus Boyd, Tyron Smith at left tackle, Tyler Biadasz was a solid center. Like, they lost good players. Tony Pollard at running back, comparable to Mixon. So, anyway, what else you got on the Cowboys?
That's basically it, that they've done a perfectly serviceable job.
Bang-up job.
For some reason is being hated on relative to other people.
Go talk to Trevor.
I don't need to talk to Trevor. It's you as well.
Yeah, I thought Dallas's offseason looked better last year when you bring in Brandon Cooks to fill a direct need, Stephon Gilmore to fill a direct need, and they had a pretty loaded roster last year. They just, things get a little too tight in the playoffs,
Okay.
Denver Broncos, we got a B- here. Russell Wilson moves on. You take all that dead cap. Justin Simmons out. Jerry Jeudy out. Lloyd Cushenberry III out. But you got Bo Nix coming in to play quarterback. That's all they really could do. QB6 off the board at pick 12, no second-round pick. And we all liked Denver's draft, so it feels like a bit of a transition year here for Denver as they get a little bit younger and get a new quarterback into town.
Where do you sort of factor in, because they voluntarily said Russell Wilson, bye-bye, So this is another one where the hole at quarterback, which is obviously what their entire offseason is about, was a hole of their making. I mean, Russell Wilson was under contract, a massive contract, and you're voluntarily eating a ton of dead cap hit to get rid of him and say, no, we don't want you. We actually are better off without you being here, even though we don't have a plan to replace you yet. So where does that factor into their offseason grade?
I mean, I don't know if it affects Denver's win total this year, but it was probably better not to just ride out the string with Russ. So I'm okay with that move, even though they take a step back before they take one forward. So when we're talking about their offseason, I don't think it means, hey, I don't even know how many games they won last year. Are they going to win more games this year? I don't know if that's the way we want to be judging this thing, but the idea of getting out of Russ's contract, taking the big hit right now, taking a shot on another first-round quarterback and getting younger, I think all that's fine.
It all comes down to really what you think of Bo Nix. I mean, Bo Nix to Denver was a move a lot of people were connecting and making and having as made sense all the way through the draft process. But the way that draft unfolded with quarterbacks flying off the board, with Michael Penix being added to the top 10 unexpectedly, there's certainly a whiff of the Christian Ponder, Jake Lockers to the Bo Nix selection where he got taken. It's like, oh no, quarterbacks are going quick. Can't do anything else. Grab him. It doesn't matter that he's not worth a first-round selection. Just take him. We need one. Now, it might not have been that. Maybe he was their guy the whole way, right? It's like their board goes Caleb Williams number 1, Bo Nix number 2. It might be true. But from the outside, it's definitely, if you're Occam's razor here, which is the more likely thing, it feels more likely that was a Christian Ponder type of dynamic than it was he was the dude all along and we love him.
Yeah, it's another one of those teams, though, too, where it's you trade a Jerry Jeudy, Marvin Mims needs to step up in year 2, or Troy Franklin as a fourth-rounder needs to be as good as we thought he could be at the NFL level. It's a year of figuring out who the young players are, and the Bo Nix thing, it's like, yeah, I mean, there's probably an element of we don't have a second-round pick, and you got to take somebody, and let's see what we have. So I'm fine with the move to just get into a new quarterback and see how he fits.
I mean, this is another one that feels a lot, again, like Dallas, where it's all about replacing the holes that you created, and it's hard to look at them now, even with, I mean, in this case, I think we like generally their draft players better than Dallas. Like Jonah Ellis, I think is the mid-round sort of developmental pass rushing prospect that I would have chosen. Troy Franklin, I think, had first-round talent, let alone the fourth. So I love the draft that they had outside of the Bo Nix thing, but the rookie. So if that's our criticism for Dallas, it's hard to give Denver, I think, a better offseason grade.
Oh, geez, you're just going to compare everybody.
They lost Justin Simmons, Jerry Jeudy, Lloyd Cushenberry, they've Russell Wilson at quarterback. Like, they lost a ton.
Dallas is trying to get over the hump in the NFC, win more than one playoff game, and win a Super Bowl.
How does that
Denver
change? The question is, are they better or not than before the offseason started?
No. It's grading their offseason.
Right. Which is determined by are they better or not than they were before the offseason started.
In Denver's situation, you would say it doesn't mean that they're trying to become a 9-win team in 2024. Like, did they do the moves to put the organization on the right track? It's going to look different because they took this big cap hit on Russ to get better in, say, 2025 and 26.
So if
it's just a different standard. They're in a different part of their life cycle.
So you're telling me that a team would get a good offseason grade for intentionally tanking?
I mean, dude, it's grades. You could put whatever grades you want on it. But if the Cardinals last year, when they knew that they didn't have Kyler Murray, I wasn't going to grade their offseason based off how much talent did they add for 2023. It was how well have they set themselves up for 24 and 25. Because that's where they are in their life cycle. The life cycle of the team and the roster matters. Because not everybody's a real Super Bowl contender, even though we're all, having positive vibes here during minicamp season.
So if your standard is not are they a better football team now than they were before the offseason started, and actually we're a grading process here and what they've done, I don't think you can love the process either, because the Bo Nix pick stinks of Christian Ponder syndrome from a team management standpoint.
You were just bringing up the alternatives, though. The alternatives for the Broncos were, Spencer Rattler in a later draft or
punt
Jarrett
on quarterback.
Stidham.
Right. Or punt on quarterback because the alternative is taking the guy that in the top half of the first round that we don't think has any business being
I'm just
there.
Team take shots on quarterback, right? You're giving up one of the better. You're giving up Laiatu Latu. You're giving up Terrion Arnold or Quinyon Mitchell. You're giving up one of the other defensive players in the draft to take a stab at quarterback.
But this is the same criticism other than the fact that they have Kirk Cousins there already, this is the criticism of Atlanta. Like, they could have taken one of the best players in the draft to make an impact on the right now.
QB side of
versus
history.
The quarterback that we don't think is going to be the guy.
I'm going to stay on the QB side and say that's all fine. B- is fine for me. The Broncos. Do you have a better grade for them?
A worse one, yes.
D+.
I think that's no. I just think, look, if Dallas is setting the precedent at a C+, This is not a better offseason than Dallas.
All right, so if you want to compare everybody to Dallas, let's go to the
For the moment, yeah.
Detroit Lions.
This is a better offseason than Dallas.
Okay. They directly replaced they filled all their needs. A+ here from Trevor, and tough to disagree. Lions looking good, man. Both sides of the ball. They had a cornerback need, attacked it with enthusiasm unknown to mankind, like Jim Harbaugh would. Trading for Carlton Davis, and then trading up to draft Terrion Arnold, Ennis Rakestraw from Missouri as their second-round pick. So, love what the Lions have done here.
Yeah, the Lions, I think, excel both in terms of personnel, just unbiased analysis of the players they brought in, and also process standpoint. Like, I think this regime, the Brad Holmes, Dan Campbell axis, are just doing such an amazing job of forget the players that they're bringing in for a moment. Just the process, the way they're doing it, I think is really, like, they are genuinely, they have been one of the best run teams since they got in that building, and continue to do it in a really good job, which doesn't mean to say everything they do is right. Like everybody else, they're going to make mistakes and they're going to swing and miss on certain positions or certain personnel moves. But the way that they're able to build in contingency or double back and, fix a mistake is just so good. And now we're seeing them tick this off. Like, part of their offseason has got to be, they've now given a monster contract out to Amon-Ra St. Brown. They've given a monster contract out to Penei Sewell, and now they've locked up Jared Goff long-term as well. You live in this world, we live in this world where there's a fixed salary cap, there's only so much money to go around, and you can probably only have 5 or 6 big money contracts on your roster, right? And if you're doing that, you would say, okay, what positions or what players do we want to have those 5 or 6 contracts? Well, the 3 they gave out this offseason would be on the list, right? Cornerstone tackle, best receiver, quarterback. Those are 3 of your 5 or 6 contracts.
And then it'll be edge for
And the next
Aiden
2
Hutchinson.
deals they've got coming up are Alim McNeil and Aiden Hutchinson. Those
Right.
might be the next 2 guys you would give the deals out to.
And I think, they've got Carlton Davis III, who I think is a good, solid corner. Wasn't as good last year, but historically a good corner. You're going to have a year of him. His salary's off the books as Goff's number starts to go up over the next couple of years. I think they're balancing those things. And, the next step for Detroit is to continue to hit on draft picks, right? So last year's draft, where they had 4 picks in the top 53, 55, and 5 picks in the top 55, and 4 of them contributed right away. That's like the fallout of the Matthew Stafford trade. That's not going to be a reality all the time for Detroit, having that many picks and that many contributors. So it's going to be a little bit more challenging when you have your normal allotment of draft capital to just stay young and continue to have those replacements. But to this point, I think it's just been a very good balance of drafting in volume like they did last year. They did trade up, to go get Terrion Arnold, to go get that one player. But I think you can balance that because of how many good players they brought in over the last 3 years.
Yeah, I think there's multiple defenses of that move. Number one, I do think that there is something to this idea of, if you trade up to get what is theoretically a blue, like, you have to have some sort of analysis of your degree of confidence in and your level of how high you think this guy was. So in particular, trading up to grab what you believe is a blue chip prospect in a draft that runs out of them quite quickly, right? So I think there's a difference between trading up in the second round, where the difference between 35 and 45 is probably negligible, to trading up in the first round when you might be getting a player that, okay, even if he's falling to 24 or whatever, if you believe, or if the consensus board, if the consensus is that guy's actually like a top 10 player, which you can make the case for Arnold. I think he was 11 or 12 on the consensus board. They end up getting him in the 20s. And then number 2, again, the contingency, understanding. We might have it wrong. We might be wrong here. Like, that's part of why trading up is such a bad idea in general terms, because teams don't build in contingency. They go, we just traded for this guy. He's everything. Let's go. And then they screw it up, right? He's not that guy. And suddenly you've got no more alternatives. The Lions traded up for what they believe is probably the best corner in this draft, or a top 10 player. And then the very next pick in the second round, they went, yeah, but we might be wrong. Let's get another one just in case. And they get Ennis Rakestraw, who's a great fallback plan. So again, just love the the way that they are doing this from a process standpoint.
And so the other way to my heart is to get established veterans to fill your needs in the offseason, right? Kevin Zeitler at right guard, DJ Reader on the defensive line. I'm also probably going to fall for Marcus Davenport every offseason on all of his one-year deals because they're one-year deals. And the potential, I think, is still there for Davenport. When he's healthy, he is a solid player. What's his cutoff? Has he never played more than 500 snaps, 600 snaps?
It's also cheaper than it was a year ago.
Oh, I mean, it's half the price as last year. That also fills a need, and I think as they get healthier on the defensive line, they'll look deeper this year in Detroit. So I love a lot of what Detroit has done, not just this offseason, but the last 3 offseasons, and that's why they have one of the best rosters in the NFL.
Yeah, he has one season in his NFL career with more than 500 snaps, and that was 533 5 years ago.
I'm willing to bet that this is going to be the year that you get the 500 to 600 good, solid snaps out of Marcus Davenport. I like taking that shot on a one-year contract.
I liked it last year at $10 million or whatever the Vikings were playing him. Now it's $6.5 because he had the year where he only had 100 and something snaps for the Vikings. Like it's perfect. They're buying even lower than Minnesota was.
He's liable to be that guy that has that one big year, and then someone signs him to a big deal.
Yeah, like
off of that.
Last year didn't change the high end of outcomes for Marcus Davenport, right? Like it's the same gamble the Vikings took a year ago. Only it's cheaper because he only played 100 and something snaps last year because he spent basically the entire year injured. Like it's the low end is pretty much the same. You know that the worst thing that could happen is he gets hurt and doesn't feature, right? That was the same a year ago as it is now. And the high end hasn't changed either because he's still capable of having a season where he puts it all together, plays 600 snaps and gets 55 pressures for you. Only the price went down because he played basically didn't play last year. So again, another move that's just awesome process.
We're going team by team, grading their offseason. It's all over at PFF.com. Trevor Sikkema putting the initial grades on. We're reciting those grades, not necessarily endorsing either way. You'll see us disagree at points. Green Bay Packers with a B per Trevor. And look, I mean, I didn't think they had a ton of work to do because of how young they were or have been and how exciting they were last year. But Devondre Campbell out at linebacker. I think the most interesting move is going to be at running back where they release Aaron Jones and then bring in Josh Jacobs on a pretty big deal for running back. And they signed Xavier McKinney, probably their other big splash move to play free safety. McKinney has been the highest graded free safety or, when lined up at free safety, highest grade in the NFL since entering the league 4 years ago. Packers going to play a little bit more single high, put McKinney in that position. So a good fit there for Green Bay. And then, of course, they drafted 100 times again and bring in a ton of volume through the draft once again.
Yeah, I mean, I like their free agent or their offseason generally, but I think you're right. Like part of having the youngest roster in the NFL last year and then expected to have it again this year and having so many draft picks is you are going to be invested in the youth. Like you're not going to be making you're not going to be having the same level of roster churn in terms of veterans that a lot of other teams are because you're simply way younger than that. And they're not losing so many players. I think their free agency was a little bit like some of these other teams we talked about, losing a guy, replacing a guy. In their cases, I mean, Xavier McKinney is a better safety than Darnell Savage. At this point, Josh Jacobs might be a better bet at running back on effectively the same contract as Aaron Jones was on. They're both 4-year, $48 million deals. Jacobs is younger and has less wear and less of an injury history than Aaron Jones does, even if he's had his own issues. So I think you'd say they probably got better in the free agent portion of the offseason. And then their draft strategy is let's bring in 12 players. Let's bring in 10-plus guys and see what they can do.
Really liked their 2 second-round picks, Edgerrin Cooper, the linebacker out of Texas A&M, safety Javon Bullard out of Georgia. I think those guys have a chance to contribute right away. Jordan Morgan, is he going to maybe move to guard, develop as a tackle, just throw him into the mix of developmental Packers offensive linemen where they've had a pretty good history there. So it was very Packers offseason. I think they've been particular in free agency. And so when they go get a guy like Xavier McKinney, there's a reason, right? They've been very particular with where they're going to spend their money over the last few years in particular. So looking pretty good there. They have a lot of money invested in the back seven, but also some contingency in depth that they've built because they've been drafting so much and getting so young over these last couple of years.
Yep.
Good offseason for the Packers.
I liked it. Yeah, solid.
So what was it? B?
B.
Feel like a B?
Solid, unspectacular.
Maybe a B+. Speaking of B+, that's where Trevor went with the Houston Texans. See, I would probably go A here because they got shiny objects. They got all the shinies.
You're a big shiny object.
Love the shiny objects. We got to go back on all my shiny object takes.
It's the desk currently being adorned by awards we didn't win.
Yeah, look at this. I got a belt. Anyway. They got Stephon Diggs.
They did.
That's good. They loaded up at playmaker. I love that for Houston. So Stephon Diggs in, and then Jonathan Grenard, who's coming off a career year. They lose him in free agency, but replace him directly with Danielle Hunter. A little bit more money than Grenard got. But, yeah, I like what Houston is doing because we're into year 2 of C.J. Stroud, and they're making some big moves.
Yeah.
I think the only question is cornerback. Now, the biggest question, maybe cornerback opposite Derek Stingley Jr. Have they done enough there between Jeff Okudah coming in, C.J. Henderson, Kamari Lassiter in the draft? But love what Houston's done this offseason.
They're the flip side of the conversation we were having earlier, where they're unquestionably better now than they were at the start of the offseason. But the question is the process the right one? And by that I mean, like, they've gone quite aggressively win now versus maybe the future. It's not like they mortgage the future to do this, but you don't tend to see teams as new on the scene in terms of being contenders. Like right now, I think everyone thinks the Houston Texans are not just a playoff team, but they want to make some noise. Like, they want to win a Super Bowl. So you don't tend to see teams so new to that conversation push as many chips into the middle of the table as the Texans did this offseason with Danielle Hunter and Joe Mixon and Stephon Diggs. And yet they have done it. So they're way better than they were. But the question is that the right approach? And is the process the correct one, or did they go a bit too aggressive with the sort of excitement of being new on the scene? I think you can give them the benefit of the doubt. It's not like, as I said, they haven't mortgaged the future. None of these are necessarily bad moves long term. I mean, the Diggs thing is literally a 1-year rental because they've reworked his contract already. He will be a free agent at the end of the year. It's not even a question anymore. That's the one move, but like what they gave up for Diggs, even if it's a 1-year rental, it's fine.
Never got to the bottom of why they did that, the Diggs. They chopped a year.
Yeah, well, they got rid of multiple years, I think, off the back end of his deal.
Not sure exactly because it doesn't affect comp picks or anything like that. But look, it's, you know me, I always start with QB. Is the offensive line good enough? And then the receivers. I think we've seen that the offensive line, particularly in any sort of Shanahan scheme derivative, looks good enough no matter what is on paper there. Houston's going to be good enough there. And now our friend Bobby Slowick has a Stephon Diggs to work with, to go with Nico Collins, who had a 91.4 PFF grade last year in a breakout season, Tank Dell, who we loved and, loved what he did last year, and Dalton Schultz, who has become a very good, as I've joked, Dalton Schultz is the guy who's always playing with this awesome trio of receivers, just like he did in Dallas. He's going to do it in Houston.
And Noah Brown, the best wide receiver 4 in the NFL.
Right. Unlocking 5-star potential out of Noah Brown. So
the ghost of Robert Woods.
From a team building standpoint, that's how I would do it. I would load up at receiver, give my quarterback every opportunity to succeed, and I would do it as early in his rookie contract as possible. So I love what Houston's doing there. Even Joe Mixon, right? So
yeah,
he's an improvement. They were very inconsistent running the ball last year. There were times when Devin Singletary ran the ball pretty well, but Mixon's I think you know what you're going to get with Mixon, right? Kind of Thomas Jones plus at this point in his career. He's going to get what's there and maximize what you have there. I don't think he's great, but he's solid at running back. That's an improvement. Danielle Hunter opposite Will Anderson. Danico Autry, I think, was maybe for the money for a 34-year-old, maybe a lot, but Autry's been a really versatile player through the years. So lots to like about what Houston has done from a team-building standpoint. Like I said earlier, just a matter of finding that cornerback too.
Yeah,
and they've thrown a few darts at that as well.
Yeah, they've done a pretty good job of that. I think they added the reclamation projects in terms of former top 10 draft picks, Jeff Okudah, C.J. Henderson, but they also bring in Kamari Lassiter, like one of was their top draft pick. Was that their first pick? Was on that position as well. So they've thrown the darts at it. They've done a reasonable job of trying to blanket as many players and options at that spot as they can get.
All right. I would give the Texans an A. Trevor goes B+. I'm giving him an A.
I'd be okay with A.
Because they got all the good stuff. All right, Indianapolis Colts, another B+ here for the AFC South Colts. They brought back Michael Pittman Jr., re-signing him. And look, they got Latu in the draft. Always going to complement that move. And then A.D. Mitchell in the second round. So 2 first-round, what people expected to be first-round caliber players, way lower than they were expected to go. So kind of like what the Colts did this offseason.
Yeah, I mean, I really like their draft. It was one of my favorite drafts. I don't know how much credit you give them for re-signing Michael Pittman. Now, they re-signed him long-term, right? He was never getting out of there. You know, if they lost Michael Pittman in the offseason, it would have been an absolute disaster. So he was getting franchise tagged and kept around, worst case scenario. They did get the deal done with him long term. That is a positive thing in their favor. You can't give them that much credit for it because they were never really going to lose him. But getting Adonai Mitchell in the draft, I think, is a steal for them. I mean, he had first-round talent, first-round ability, first-round potential. Now he doesn't even need to be the number one. Like, he's not gone to a team that desperately needs him to make an immediate impact. He can go there and compete with Alec Pierce and basically replace that level of production. Josh Downs in the slot. Like, Pittman, Downs, that's a good foundation. If Mitchell can be an upgrade over Pierce, which he should be, it was a good addition.
Let Pierce be a deep threat and then get Latu on that defensive line that already has Kwity Paye, DeForest Buckner, has Grover Stewart, who they brought back. So they got some depth now on that defensive line. Really like that. I guess my only question that I kept bringing up throughout draft season and everything, how much do they trust their corners versus how much would I trust their corners? They got really young there last year, got solid play out of those guys. Juju Brents, last year's second rounder, Jalen Jones, who was a seventh rounder with good size. They're all big, long, and athletic. Dallas Flowers, Darrell Baker Jr. You just need 2 of those guys to really emerge and be those guys at corner. But yeah, I think Colts are looking pretty good and putting Anthony Richardson in position to succeed in year 2.
Yep. Very solid offseason.
Great. We're not even halfway through, so we do need to pick up the pace a little bit. That's good. Anything else on the Colts?
No, I think we've covered it, right? That's their offseason.
Jacksonville Jaguars. Trevor went C+ here for the Jags. I mean, this is the one where I think you could compare it a little bit more to the Bengals and the Cowboys. A lot of players out and a lot of players in, right? So you lose like a Calvin Ridley at receiver, but you got Gabe Davis coming in, Brian Thomas Jr. in the first round. You lose Darius Williams at corner. He was their highest graded cornerback last year. And you got to call him the rent-a-corner. Ronald Darby coming in to play. Mitch Morse comes in to play center. That's an upgrade for what they've had there at the position the last couple of years. And then Eric Armstead, I think, is a big signing for the Jags, who just need more.
That's their best move.
They just need more pass rush potential on that defensive line. I think not only does it helps Trayvon Walker maybe not be relied upon as much, but it allows him to move around schematically and gives Josh Allen some help up front.
Yeah, the Eric Armstead move, I think, is their best single offseason move in any direction. I agree. I think this is a lot like the Bengals and the Cowboys off seasons, and I think it's got a C+ in Trevor's grade, which is the same as he gave Dallas, right? Which I think is about right. Like they've, and again, it's always conditioned by how you view the players in particular that they've drafted, and because I don't think either of us has the same personnel philosophy as Trent Baalke appears to have, so we're unlikely to ever like a significant swathe of Jaguars moves. But Ridley to Gabe Davis, if we see that as a like-for-like move, I think Ridley's a better player than Gabe Davis, but I think Gabe Davis may have been like a better schematic combination than Ridley. Like Ridley and Kirk, I don't think is necessarily as good as Gabe Davis and Kirk stylistically. So that might net out as a win, or at least equalize the difference in talent. Brian Thomas Jr., it's going to come down to whether he's better than I think he is, or whether he can do more than his sort of one-trick pony ability that he was in college. Like, they just didn't ask him. Like 75% of his production came on hitches and goes, right? You're going to need to do more than that in the NFL. Now, if you can, cool, we're in business. That's a first-round pick well spent if he can take that size and athleticism and explosiveness and apply it to a much broader variety of things than he was doing in college. If he can't, and he's actually just a one-trick pony, that he is like he's Marquez Valdes-Scantling, and that guy just signed for $5 million or something. So that's what this offseason is going to be really contingent on, is that first-round selection.
And for me, I think it's kind of the opposite of what we talked about with the Bills. Are they moving to an offense that's becoming less vertical, relying more on yak, maybe trying to run the ball a little bit more? Is the Jags offense just going full vertical offense here? Are they going Brian Thomas Jr., Gabe Davis, their ability to stretch the field, Christian Kirk out of the slot, and then Evan Ingram as their best underneath option? Are they going to try to stretch the field a little bit more, get more out of Trevor Lawrence throwing the ball down the field?
And can you do that anymore? I mean, this is like every defense in the last few years has been specifically honed in on taking away explosive plays and limiting those big plays. Now, they're not the only team that's been doing that this offseason. Like the Chiefs have pivoted to more vertical receivers again, having obviously traded away the best vertical receiver in football a couple of years ago, lost all vertical threat. Kansas City this offseason bring in Marquise Brown and Xavier Worthy, like two legit speedsters that you would seem specialized vertically. So can that still work? Like, can you create an offense now in today's NFL that focuses on explosive vertical, big impact passing plays, or has the rise of the Vic Fangio defense and the pivot of defensive schemes in the NFL generally really taken away or handicapped those types of offenses? And if they have, it means that the approach that Jacksonville and Kansas City and maybe another team or two have taken is not the right one. And actually, unless those guys can do more than that, this is an offense that's always going to seem like it's disjointed.
Yeah, we'll talk about the Chiefs in just a second here. But for the Jags, I think I'd go a little bit better than C+. I think earlier in the offseason, I didn't love it because it did feel like their losses were significant. But there's a lot of like-for-like types of replacements. And I thought the Eric Armstead one could really pay dividends, just again because of the pressure that it takes off of Josh Allen, Trayvon Walker, and the versatility that it gives them up front. So I think the Jags are a little more in the B range, I would say, closer to B's.
By the Dallas rule, they are a C+.
Great. Kansas City Chiefs, you were just talking about, and the verticality that they've added to their offense. Trevor goes A here for the Kansas City Chiefs. Marquez Valdes-Scantling is out, but you've got Marquise Brown in as that deep threat to go with Xavier Worthy, their first-round pick, who they traded up to get. And then the whole offseason started with, hey, we've got Chris Jones, we have Travis Kelce back, locked in for multiple years, kept the gang together other than L'Jarius Sneed. He was the one guy. They ended up trading him away. It was a mid-round pick, third-round pick, and there was the one guy, like, you have to make your decisions where you can't invest long-term, and it's L'Jarius Sneed. So maybe the cornerback position, takes a hit, certainly takes a hit for the Chiefs. However, it's not like, they've got Trent McDuffie. They have players. They've got the young players that they've developed the last couple of years. They have contingency at corner.
Yeah, but it's not like Trent McDuffie, he's not stepping into a bigger role now that L'Jarius Sneed is gone. Like, those two guys were two of their top corners last season. So, Trent, it's still a loss. It's like we were talking about with some of these other teams earlier. Like, they're going to need to replace L'Jarius Sneed, and it's not like Trent McDuffie is not the player replacing L'Jarius Sneed. It's going to be some other guys that have to step up into a bigger role on that defense. So I think they're definitely worse at that spot. They did a good job keeping Chris Jones around, keeping Travis Kelce around. I mean, Kelce wasn't going anywhere anyway, but Chris Jones could have left. They at least
kept Kelce from retirement.
Right. They at least kept one of those two superstar defensive players that they were potentially going to lose if they hadn't done anything. So that, that's a win. But the real work being done is what we just talked about, the receivers. Like, they bring in Marquise Brown, they bring in Xavier Worthy to upgrade what was a bad receiver core a year ago, and was rescued by the late play in particular of Rashee Rice, who himself now created question marks. I don't think you can penalize the Chiefs necessarily for Rashee Rice getting into street racing and allegedly punching somebody in a nightclub, but these are, however, issues that they have to contend with.
Well, I mean, if you listen to the anonymous scouts before the draft, you would anticipate
but that's not a this offseason problem.
Right,
that's your chickens are coming home to roost after last offseason.
Draft-wise, of course, Xavier Worthy is the biggest move, but Kingsley Suamataia coming in to compete at left tackle.
BYU.
BYU. You just
another in a long line of BYU tackles.
BYU expert over
in
there.
the NFL.
I think that's probably the most uncomfortable spot there. Wanye Morris is the projected starting left tackle, last year's third rounder.
They're another, we like what we said. Atlanta probably doesn't have CB2 on the roster. I would say Kansas City probably doesn't start the season with Wanye Morris.
I'm not a Wanye Morris guy. I mean, he was like a 15th percentile model guy, and last year he did grade at 55.6. And when it felt like the sky was falling for Kansas City, it did kind of coincide with his needing to step in at left tackle with Donovan Smith before the playoffs. Remember, Donovan Smith came back for the playoff run and provided solid left tackle play. So that's one of the big question marks.
There are some veteran left tackles available that would absolutely upgrade Wanye Morris. And this was, remember last year, like they signed Jawan Taylor to this huge deal. They're like, he's going to play left tackle. We were, that doesn't sound like a great idea. And then later on in the offseason, they signed Donovan Smith. You're like, okay, that makes more sense. They could do that again. I mean, Donovan Smith, I think, is still himself available out in the free agent world. But there'll be, I would put some money down on the idea that they'll sign somebody.
It is one of those interesting things because you keep talking about counterfactuals. Supposedly the Chiefs were trying to trade up into the teens to get a guy like Amarius Mims before the Bengals picked him up. So clearly the Chiefs are thinking about left tackle. They're not feeling completely secure in Wanye. And the domino effect of if they had traded up for the tackle, they wouldn't have had Xavier Worthy, the deep threat. So right now they're sitting with two really good deep threats at receiver, but questions at left tackle to still solve. But like you said, there are solutions out there.
And I do think that both of those receivers can be more than just that designated deep threat. Like in potentially contrast to Jacksonville, like Gabe Davis doesn't seem like he can do much more than that. Brian Thomas Jr., I don't know if he can. Like, we'll find that out. But I have a higher degree of confidence that both of the receivers that the Chiefs assigned, who look similarly designated deep threat, one-trick pony, I think both those guys can be much more than that. And therefore, even if it turns out Vic Fangio and NFL defenses have simply changed the dynamic and you can't be that vertical designed offense anymore, I think the Chiefs are better equipped to pivot than Jacksonville is.
All right, I think we're about halfway through the league here, Sam.
Oh, God.
Hour and a half into the show. Las Vegas Raiders. Do we turn this into part one, part two?
I need to be out of here by 2, so that's our hard out.
It's 2 more hours. We got this. Las Vegas Raiders. Trevor goes B for the Raiders. Biggest signing is Christian Wilkins coming in from the Miami Dolphins to play defensive tackle. And then Gardner Minshew added to the quarterback room with Aiden O'Connell. Biggest loss, Josh Jacobs, Jermaine Illuminor on the offensive line. First 2 draft picks, you got Brock Bowers coming in at tight end / just overall playmaker, and then Jackson Powers-Johnson in the second round. I mean, for me, the biggest question for the Raiders is, okay, are you feeling good about the quarterback position? You don't necessarily have your QB of the future, but everything else seems fine.
Yeah, so if you take away the quarterback's question, like if you just looked at their moves, additions, subtractions, what they've done, the Raiders had a good offseason, but you have to view it through the prism of what they did at quarterback and what could they have done at quarterback. Or, so that's the thing. It's like, okay, Gardner Minshew coming in, he's a good, like he might be the best backup quarterback in the NFL or one of those sort of marginal starter guys that can be fine for a season. I mean, he did good work for Indianapolis last year, right? But if he's your number one quarterback, you don't have a good quarterback situation. So you look at the Raiders and you're like, okay, what is a reasonable expectation for them to have fixed the quarterback situation over this offseason? Because this is now the second year in a row where it's felt like they did need a quarterback and didn't really come away with one. So I think that's how you have to view this offseason, through that lens of they got Minshew. Is that better or worse than the baseline expectation of going into an offseason with a hole at quarterback, needing a quarterback? I think you have to see that as worse than expectation.
I feel like this offseason is going to feel better maybe next year when they're, again, I've mentioned this before, they're looking for a quarterback. They're going to be, trying to steal a Dak Prescott, draft for the quarterback, whatever it might be, and say, hey, we've got Brock Bowers over here. We've got a playmaker. We got a solid offensive line because JPJ comes in to help solidify that. even though the defense played much better down the stretch, I think adding a Christian Wilkins was needed. They've needed some help on the defensive line from Max Crosby. Malcolm Kuntz had a nice breakout season last year. We'll see if Tyree Wilson can, add to that mix in year 2. But they definitely needed some playmaker help on the defensive side of the ball, and they got that.
Yeah, I mean, Dak Prescott being an option for them next offseason would be very interesting. They're expected to be bad this year if you look at sort of Vegas win totals, but not. It's not like they're on course. I mean, these things obviously can change. Like, we thought the Panthers would be better than they were last season. We thought the Cardinals and the Texans would be 2 of the worst teams in the NFL. Only one of them was. But the Raiders I think their win total is 6.5 right now. The worst teams are at 4.5. So it's not like we expect them to have the number 1 overall pick next year and have their shot at the quarterback that way. They might be within range of one, but Dak Prescott being an option would definitely transform things. But I think overall, this was a good offseason for them if you simply ignore the quarterback situation. But as we know, that's everything.
Yeah, so that's the only uneasiness, I think, with what the Raiders have done so far. All right, staying in the AFC West, we get the Los Angeles Chargers. Trevor going with an A- here for the Chargers. A lot of turnover at receiver. We got Mike Williams and Keenan Allen out. Had to make those moves because, the Chargers had the other LA version of stars and scrubs. They had a whole bunch of $20 million type of players. Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, the 2 receivers I just mentioned, had to get out from a couple of those contracts, go into the draft with one of the worst receiver rooms in the NFL. They come out of it with Ladd McConkey, but also solidified that offensive line with Joe Alt in the first round. Big-time transition year here for the Chargers.
Yeah, and I think, so we didn't mention this with the Raiders, but we're going to bring it up for the Chargers. Like, part of their offseason is Jim Harbaugh, right? They snagged one of the biggest fish in the entire offseason pool in terms of front office, coaching, all those kinds of things. The Raiders, I think they made the right call in Antonio Pierce. Like, I think that roster would have revolted, would have rebelled if they hadn't given Antonio Pierce the job after what he did towards the end of last season. So I think that was the right move for them. The Chargers, they got Jim Harbaugh. I mean, he was the big fish in this coaching pool. I think the guy a lot of people would have wanted if it hadn't become clear the way he was going to go. So that's a big positive for the Chargers this offseason. They got Jim Harbaugh, incredible track record of success literally everywhere he's been in his coaching tenure, whether it's the NFL or the college landscape. He has won everywhere. You would expect him to do it again sooner or later with the Chargers. And then you get into their personnel moves, which I think generally have been, again, intriguing because they've done a good job backfilling. But, you traded away Keenan Allen. You let Mike Williams hit the open market, which may have been the right moves, but, it's the hole that you created.
So I wonder if, because it's Greg Roman, it's more of a throw a fullback around the formation, multiple tight end type of offense. I like to look at receiving cores as like your top 3, and I want to see 4, good ones, and that 4 being a deep threat in particular. Do we have to look at the Chargers receiving core differently and say, okay, you just got to find a top 2 out of this group? But the group is Quentin Johnston, DJ Chark, who comes in,
right?
Josh Palmer, Ladd McConkey, Brendan Rice. Jerry said he's going to be working him hard as a 7th round.
He's taking over now.
So you got to find 2 out of those guys. Yeah. I mean, DJ Chark and Quentin Johnston, man. If they're your 1-2, and it's like, man, we're gonna make 1 or 2 great plays, but just drive you nuts on all the others. That could be tough. That could be difficult there.
I mean, there's
a running game with Greg Roman that has very much relied on a running quarterback, or a quarterback as part of the design run game. You're not going to do that with Justin Herbert. He's athletic, but you're not doing that with Justin Herbert. So you're relying on the offensive line to move people for Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, which is fine as a 1-2 punch. So I'm just interested in the whole culture shift, culture change, and seeing how it all fits together here for the Chargers.
Yeah, it's probably going to be a different dynamic with Harbaugh as the coach there than it is for most other guys. But they're a team. They're one of a few teams that have a lot now invested in these sort of fringe first, early second round wide receivers that need to come in and be their best guy. Like, if Ladd McConkey is not the best Chargers receiver this year, that's probably a bad receiving core. And even if he is, it might be a bad receiving core. That's not great from just a personnel standpoint. It isn't.
No. I mean, it depends on how you look at this. Greg Roman has had good offenses without great receivers, and you could say, hey, that's all Lamar Jackson, or that's all the run game with the Ravens, or you could say, yeah, they're gonna peak, right? They're gonna hit a ceiling just because they don't have those playmakers on the outside that you need. But yeah, I think the coaching change, culture change, and all that stuff has to be factored in here for the Chargers.
You see the picture of Joe Alt blocking a defensive back?
No.
It's pretty funny. He's
massive.
The defensive back, I think, was listed at 6 foot, 180, something like that. And it's like the pictures of you and me next to each other, where It's like these are different humans.
6'9", 320. That's me. Yeah. Close dimensions.
I mean, he made a 6 foot, 180 pound person look like a child.
Joe Alt might be, because we used to do that thing like what's your height weight compare? Like, who's your best comp in the NFL?
You were like Buckner or somebody, right?
I was Carlos Dunlap, maybe.
Dunlap. Oh yeah. He was
at one point,
right?
But Joe Alt might be my new best comp.
320? No.
I mean, if you put my weight up closer to.
You're still closer to like an Eric
I mean, on
Armstead.
the internet, I'm listed at 260.
Yeah, but you're still closer to like an Armstead than you are.
Yeah, maybe Armstead.
Than you are a Joe
But
Alt.
Alt's 6'9", and I'm
maybe Alt's
6'10".
where you can get to.
Someday I'll be Joe Alt. Yes.
But not now. Now you're still Eric Armstead or whatever.
Fair.
I mean, Armstead's 6'8", right?
Yeah, he's close.
Yeah.
All right, Los Angeles Rams, A- here from Trevor. Kind of like it, liking what the Rams have done. Of course, you can't fault them for Aaron Donald's retirement, but they attacked that, especially in the draft with Jared Verse and with Braden Fisk on the defensive line. Bring back Kevin Dotson at guard, paid him some money, bring in Jonah Jackson at guard. So you've got this, Steve Avila is going to move from guard to center. And so you got a pretty nice little trio in there for the Rams on the offensive line. Thoughts on the Rams offseason here?
What do you make of the suggestion that they were? I haven't fully read the Jordan Rodriguez article series on the Rams and their scouting.
I did. It was really good. She just writes really good stuff, man. Like she just comes up with really great ideas.
Yeah,
really
great ideas as well. No, I mean the bit that I've read so far has been fantastic. But apparently in there somewhere is this idea of this Moneyball scene idea of we can't replace Aaron Donald, but maybe we can recreate him in the aggregate. And part of the aggregate is literally getting a combination of teammates already. Let's get two guys that already have chemistry and put them on the same defensive line because we know it's going to work that way. And that will the sum of those two players, the Florida State players, Jared Verse and Braden Fisk, the sum of them together is worth more than each one individually when we keep them together and put them on the same defensive line.
Yeah, I mean, I generally like to work off of evidence before trusting those types of things, right?
Because this is the basketball theory, right? That they've been talking about for years, like the combination of the five and how each one can I mean, obviously with five guys, it's a greater ability for each one to influence the other ones. But there is that theory has been prevalent not just in football but in sports for years, that there's got to be some kind of again, this is kind of what I was saying with Gabe Davis versus Calvin Ridley. Like, is the stylistic combination or the chemistry of individuals potentially worth more, even if that guy in a vacuum is not as good a player?
Yeah. So first off, I would say, I think I would need to know evidence-wise if teammates, if there's something to teammates playing together,
right?
Like where did that come from? Is that just like when you hear Les Snead breaking down watching Jared Verse and Braden Fisk, like he was just enamored by watching them play and the energy that they brought. And I get that, but I would also want to know historically, if he brought that up, I would say, okay, well, historically, does it matter if there are two defensive line teammates who play together? Does that actually make them better? I don't know. And then the whole aggregate thing, I think you just take Aaron Donald out of the equation. I don't think you need to replace Aaron Donald, so to speak, because you could replace – they did this a couple years ago too. Like, you can replace production at defensive tackle with a linebacker, right? You might just be better at linebacker, or you might want to be better at safety. Either way, you have finite resources to spend. It doesn't mean you have to do it on the defensive line. So I don't have a strong take either way on that, because I don't have the evidence either way that we're going to take one great Hall of Fame defensive lineman, replace him with two defensive linemen, and then the second part, they also happen to be teammates and know each other. Like, I don't know if any of that stuff matters. I will say on paper, Braden Fisk in a vacuum is probably not worth this year's first rounder and next year's first rounder, right? Second rounder, sorry. He's probably not worth both.
Right.
And that's what they've invested in Braden Fisk.
That kind of, because the Michael Penix Jr. thing hid so many like wild moves in the draft that just sort of slid under the radar.
And listen, I've heard the feedback because they'll say they had a first on Braden Fisk, so they got a first-round caliber player in the second. Fine. They used a second-round pick and traded next year's second-round pick.
Yeah, but this is where
for that one player.
This is where those curves make the difference. Like, the lower in the draft you get, the less the chance is that your interpretation of we had a first on him and he was available here is correct. The higher in the draft you get, the better the chance is that that's a legitimate thing. If you're talking about, like, we had a top 5 grade on this guy and he's available at pick number 19, right? That's different to saying we had a first-round grade on him and he's available at pick number 38, right? The chances are the second one is way more close together and they're probably not. It's probably a wash versus the first one where there might actually be something to the gap between 5 and number 19. That's the problem with the second-round trade stuff where you're like, well, we had a first-round grade on him. It's like, yeah, but the chances are there's not much difference between him and the next guy in the second round.
Wish my depth charts weren't failing in Ultimate. Can somebody call Ultimate? Fix these things?
Who's the product manager for Ultimate?
I'm getting pushed out, man, so don't blame me.
You haven't been yet, though, so it's still your problem.
Still my fault?
Yeah.
I get Eric sending me bugs right now and text messaging bugs over here.
Perfect.
Don't talk to me, man. No, it's all right. Anyway, I've liked the Rams offseason. It's not going to feel great not having Aaron Donald there. All that said,
yeah.
I mean, I like Braden Fisk as a player. I like Jared Verse as a player. If I criticize a move for future draft capital, it's just because over time I don't think 2 or 3 players are worth 1.
That's the one move.
That's the thing.
That's the, like, if it wasn't for the Michael Penix Jr. thing, like that, the Rams executed what is sort of conventional wisdom would say is the worst move in this draft. Like that trade up next year's second rounder to get Braden Fisk. All of the data says that's a terrible process move. Maybe they'll end up being proved right if Braden Fisk is a superstar, but from a process standpoint, most of the time you lose that trade if you're the Rams.
I like the moves in the secondary. Darius Williams bringing him back, and then Tre'Davious White.
Yep.
Buying low on Tre'Davious White coming off of injuries.
I like their offseason. Like if you don't ding them for the Aaron Donald thing, which you can't really. I mean, it's not their fault that he upped and quit, retired, quit. Quit's not
quit on the team.
Quit has pejoratives that I didn't intend. Yeah, retired after a Hall of Fame caliber career, having achieved everything in the game is probably a better way of putting that. If you don't blame them for that, which you can't really, then I think they've had a really good offseason. Like I love a lot of their additions. The trade for in the second round, not good. Everything else really good. Even guys like Cameron Kitchens at safety, the Miami safety, I think could end up being a starter for them.
All right, we're done with the Rams. Miami Dolphins, we got a B- here. Lose Robert Hunt at guard, Christian Wilkins at defensive tackle, Andrew Van Ginkel, but they brought in a lot of players here. Jordan Poyer, Kendall Fuller at corner, Jonnu Smith at tight end, Jordan Brooks at linebacker, Shaq Barrett at edge. They definitely loaded up on edge defenders this offseason after being depleted on their playoff run last year. Just brought in OBJ as well. I don't know if he's factored in to the grade here. But OBJ,
he's referenced, so I think he is.
He is okay. Good. So he's, he comes in to be wide receiver 3, which is it's a nice spot for OBJ to be at this point. I think he becomes maybe the best wide receiver 3 in the NFL right now. Odell Beckham?
Maybe.
No?
I mean, maybe. It's just funny. The article from Trevor says the late Odell Beckham Jr. signing. Now, because we talk about these people as being the late. It just that's how my mind read it before.
OBJ still alive and kicking and ready to play football for the Dolphins.
Absolutely. It's another team. I think they lost some big players though, like Christian Wilkins, the single most important defender to leave in free agency. Robert Hunt was one of the best players on not a good offensive line, so that's a problem. Andrew Van Ginkel coming off a career year. I mean, these are significant losses to this team. Who's trying to get over the hump, who's trying to take the next step and get one better, and instead you're like, did they even replace those holes that were significant players? I don't know that they did.
I will say the defensive tackle group for the Dolphins Jonathan Harris, who had a 52 grade last year for the Broncos. Neville Gallimore, who I did like coming out of the draft, has just never really been very stout at the point of attack. Tier Tart's a good buy low because he's played good football at points in his career. But there's a lot of questions at defensive tackle. Zach Sealer is really good. Yeah. But as far as like the depth there.
Right.
It's not great.
No, it's not. It's so that's concerning.
For a three-man front as well.
Yeah. The offensive line is still a concern. I mean, Teron Armstead, they drafted Teron Armstead insurance and Patrick Paul. That's a smart move. But you still got, the interior is rough now.
It is. That looks like one of those groups that Buffalo's been run on and Dallas has been run on in some key games over the last couple of years. Buffalo's been better, but they went through that stretch where they just felt light and felt like they couldn't hold the point all that well. That's what Miami's front looks like right now, or feels like.
You're just saying that because Aaron Brewer's the center.
No, their defensive line. They're talking about the defensive line, not their offensive. Aaron Brewer, the 270-pound modern marvel with Mike McDaniel. He's going to be pulling him into space. It's
lightweight.
Great. Brewer's great. It's like, oh, man. Mike McDaniel using basically a service academy type of style center. That's awesome. I love that.
They might need to go to that kind of offense.
I'm not saying he's a service academy
caliber player.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that service academy players aren't good. We'll end it here.
Okay.
He's just small.
Gotcha.
So it's interesting. There's a lot of big names out the door, but there's a lot that they brought in as well.
Well, they're so focused now on, they're just getting these explosive athletes across the offense. And it's like, let's hope that the combination of Mike McDaniel, which is maybe the most important thing, Tua getting the ball out of his hands really quickly, and endless explosive playmakers. Let's just hope that together is enough to overcome whatever is on the offensive line, because apparently we're not that invested in making sure that is really shored up.
It also feels like for whatever weaknesses they have on the defensive interior or the true defensive line, Jalen Phillips coming back off injury, Bradley Chubb coming back off injury, first-round pick Chop Robinson, all edges. And they brought in Shaq Barrett, like I said, sets a hard edge, plays the run pretty well. Muhammad Kamara as a mid-round pick. Like they said, never again are we just signing the 2012 draft class going into a playoff game and asking them to rush the passer against the Kansas City Chiefs in 30 below weather. Never again.
Never again.
Will that happen.
I would love to see a race organized from the skill position players. They have Anthony Schwartz as well.
I see that.
Can't play wide receiver, but can run a 4.2 something.
Yeah, Schwartz might be the fastest guy on the team.
But so you've got Jalen Waddle, Anthony Schwartz, Tyreek Hill, Raheem Mostert, Devin Achane, Jalen Wright now added. Like, this is just ridiculous in terms of speedsters.
Relative to their position, because my ultimate depth charts here, we've got the NGS speeds there.
Oh, yeah?
The fastest speed relative to their position, though, is Aaron Brewer on this team.
Yes.
Because he hit 16.8 miles an hour
carrying
last year.
30 fewer pounds than anybody else in his
So
position.
Aaron Brewer is actually pound for pound the fastest player on the Dolphins.
Pound for pound.
The big questions for the Dolphins now, they're going to pay Tua, and how do you keep this nucleus back together? And then also, how do you win against good teams, cold weather games? I don't know if they've solved those issues necessarily, but they continue to add firepower, and I think they're going to be tough to stop once again next year.
Where is that data point you're showing me?
In the depth chart?
Yeah.
You have it?
The average max speed column? Is that what I'm looking at?
The average of their top 5 max speeds, yes.
And then
his average of Brewer's top 5 is 16.8.
And that little arrow is indicating
that the dark green has that at the highest percentile.
Gotcha.
The percentiles are like a little off right now, so those arrows are a touch off. But I'll trust that Brewer's pound for pound the fastest.
Gotcha.
Still cooking here. We're still cooking. Keep the energy up, Sam.
I'm working.
What would GMAT tell us? Keep it up. Just keep it going. He would also tell us that. Minnesota Vikings, we got a B- for their offseason. Lose Danielle Hunter, replace him with Jonathan Grenard and Andrew Van Ginkel on the edge. Definitely got a lot better, I think, talent-wise on the defensive side of the ball. Dallas Turner in the first round made that power move to get him, and they got J.J. McCarthy to replace Kirk Cousins. Of course, part of this offseason is moving on from Kirk Cousins. So what are your thoughts on the Vikings offseason grade?
Yeah, and I think that has to be factored in as well, right? Again, they chose to do that. They could have re-signed Kirk Cousins. They could have given him the deal that Atlanta gave him. They chose not to. So I think how you view that has to be relevant here. I think ultimately, talk a lot about process versus results. the correct process move for a 35-year-old quarterback coming off an Achilles injury who hasn't been able to get you over the hump since he came into town is to draw a line in the sand somewhere financially and say, this is what you're worth, not beyond that, right? And if another team was willing to go beyond that, that's cool. We've got draft capital. We can go find the solution somewhere else. That's fine. So from a process standpoint, I think letting Kirk Cousins go was probably the correct thing to do, given the contract he ended up signing in Atlanta. Signing Sam Darnold, that's fine as a short-term bridge, 1 year, $10 million, whatever it is. He can start. He'll be a Pro Bowler for the first 3 games, and then the wheels will fall off, and that's when you want the next guy in anyway. So, cool. Not a problem. Process-wise, it sounds like they tried to get to number 3 for Drake May, and that was the real apple of their eye. And when that couldn't happen, they waited it out fairly well for J.J. McCarthy. Only had to trade up 1 spot to get him a 10 instead of the move to 4 or 5 that everybody was expecting them to do pre-draft. So that's another process win, I think. Now you get to the personnel point. What do you think of J.J. McCarthy as a quarterback? And maybe that gets more debatable. And then you get the Dallas Turner thing. Like, do you agree with their idea of trading up to stop the slide of a guy that they thought was a blue chip defender? So, I think overall there's a lot of moves that from a process standpoint make sense and were probably the correct thing of doing. The problem is that it leads you to this end point of saying, well, they had a high-end quarterback. They probably don't have one anymore, and it's hard to look at them and say they're dramatically better than they were before the offseason began.
We have to throw in Aaron Jones at running back as well.
Yeah.
As a nice addition there for the Vikings. We said for a while, whichever quarterback gets drafted to Minnesota, it's the best situation. Throwing to Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, Aaron Jones running the ball, TJ Hawkinson, and Josh Oliver at tight end. Pretty solid there. I mean, I think, and then listen, defensively last year on paper, they did not have talent.
Yeah.
And they didn't have a lot of talent. They've developed a couple guys. I thought what they did with Josh Metellus was great. What they did schematically was unique and gave them a chance. But they clearly went into this offseason saying, we got to be able to rush with 4. And now a 3-headed monster at edge with Van Ginkel, Grenard, and Dallas Turner that could help change things schematically here for Minnesota.
And, Turner, Van Ginkel, these are both guys that are way more suited to dropping into coverage and playing that sort of Brian Flores disguise defense of stacking everybody at the line. Some guys are going to rush, some guys are not. Like, those guys are more suited, I think, to that scheme than the players they had a year ago. Their big problem is that they still have some fairly significant holes in this defense.
All right, we're on to the New England Patriots. A B- for New England from Trevor. Of course, the biggest move is going to be getting Drake May as your drafted quarterback. You move on from Mac Jones, reshape the entire quarterback room. Jacoby Brissett's in there as a guy to either bridge the gap to Drake May or at least just provide a backup option. And bring back Hunter Henry and Kendrick Bourne, tight end and receiver, respectively. So overall, the roster still, I think, has some work to do, but the biggest move of the offseason is getting the QB of the future in Drake May.
Yeah, and of course, the single biggest move they made this offseason is by Bill Belichick.
Yeah.
That
the guy that's on McAfee all the time.
Yeah, and is busy roasting Tom Brady as part of Netflix's summer offering. That's a pretty significant thing. They have essentially said goodbye to the greatest head coach of all time, one of the architects of the dynasty that there's a TV show about. So it's a huge move. Whether or not it's correct, I don't know. Going with Gerard Mayo as well, as opposed to this sort of inbuilt, like people thought maybe they'd get Mike Vrabel, maybe they'd be in play for one of the bigger names. Instead, they had this literally a succession plan codified. Like, they had this written into contracts that Gerard Mayo would be the guy whenever they decided to move on from Bill Belichick. And they honored that and went in that direction. So that whole dynamic is, it's the biggest. Drake May coming in, that's the biggest on-field decision they can make. But this was the direction of the franchise that they decided this offseason.
Yeah, I think in addition to Drake May and then Gerard Mayo, the most interesting part of the offseason for New England is the idea that they changed a lot about how the coaching staff is built. Belichick would always promote from within, and the very few times he didn't promote from within, it was like, a couple industry friends he would bring in, right? Like the Brett Bielema's of the world. We're bringing in a mishmash of different types of coaches. it's for the first time since 2000 a new system. I think Alex Van Pelt runs your traditional West Coast terminology. Patriots never had that, so everything's new in New England. But what isn't new is Drake May, if he's the starter right away, or if it's Jacoby Brissett, gets dropped into a spot with an okay offensive line, an okay group of playmakers, and the defense, looks like on paper they're okay as well, but looks better, I think, when Belichick and the Belichicks maybe were coaching them. So we'll see if they can keep that up. So the biggest thing about the offseason was May, and a lot of the other moves were keeping a lot of the talent in-house. Michael Onwenu, who's going to come in or stay there and play right tackle. And like I mentioned, Kendrick Bourne and Hunter Henry sticking around. So a lot of this team that is one of the worst offenses in the NFL last year, a lot of that team is back. But if they're healthy, you've got at least a foundation to build upon here.
Yeah, they've made some really nice moves this offseason. Some of them were keeping their own players, like Josh Uche re-signing for like a crazy small
He really wanted to stay in New England, supposedly. So they got him on the cheap. That was a good move for sure.
Really cheap. Like, that's the kind of move that if it gets made in a fantasy league, gets vetoed by the commissioner. You know what I mean? And somehow they snagged him for almost nothing. Crazy deal from their perspective in terms of value, and from his perspective, like, he must have really wanted to stay there, because that is a fraction, I think, of what he could have got on the open market. Re-signing Onwenu is a really good move as well. Like, they've made some good decisions, but this is going to come down to, number one, obviously, what the whole restructuring does, coaching, front office as well. Like, everything changed with Belichick leaving. And then number two, Drake May and the draft class that they've put around him, because that's all that they've been able to put around him, really. Does Drake May have enough to work with in Juju Smith-Schuster, Kendrick Bourne, the two rookies, Jalen Polk, Javon Baker that they drafted, Tyquan Thornton, the Demario Douglas, the kind of holdovers from the previous group, or is this offense really still going to struggle with a young quarterback?
All right, we're on to the New Orleans Saints. Trevor's going B+ for the Saints offseason. I think move for move, it's not a bad offseason for the Saints. I think the uneasy feeling that I have for New Orleans is uncertainty around Ryan Ramczyk at tackle, maybe having to go into the draft, drafting a tackle, which they did in the first round. Talise Fuanga coming in, liked that as a move. Do they have enough on both sides of the ball to improve? I don't know, but I did really like the Saints draft with Fuanga in the first, Kool-Aid McKinstry in the second, and then fifth rounder Spencer Rattler, taking a flyer on him to back up Derek Carr.
Yeah, no, I think that was a really nice draft. I think they did a really good job there. The great, don't forget, Bub Means in the fifth round.
Your guy, Bub.
That'll help replace Michael Thomas.
The next Devery Henderson, as I said.
Yeah.
Saints.
And then, they had some offseason losses, but they were guys that made sense to let go. I mean, Jameis Winston, backup quarterback there. Andres Pete, who's been problematic more than he's been a positive for them during most of his time there. Michael Thomas, who just isn't the same player that he was before all the injuries. And then they made some additions. Willie Gay, I think, is still a really talented coverage type of linebacker. Chase Young, they've taken the Chase Young gamble, brought him in to try and get the best out of him. And the best out of him is still, like, really high end.
I'm for all the Chase Young gambles for sure. So I do like that move by the Saints. They need some of their younger defensive linemen still to step up. But Chase Young pairing with Carl Granderson does look solid for the Saints. Again, they're not in a position to make a ton of flashy moves, right? They're always restructuring and letting veterans walk because of cap issues. Marshawn Lattimore could be the next guy that you might see out the door, but you've got Kool-Aid McKinstry as a guy that is there to replace him. So again, I don't know if the Saints are much better than they were last year. There's those questions on the offensive line that need to be solved.
The offensive line as a totality still feels like a problem.
Yeah. I think they did okay with what they had, though.
Yeah.
As far as resources go. And they're still sitting in an NFC South. I know the Bucs stepped up and looked like a pretty good team down the stretch, but it still looks like a very winnable NFC South.
Yeah.
And, the Saints competing with the Falcons, the Bucs, and, the whatever the Panthers can muster this year. it's winnable. So I don't think you have to win the offseason to be competing in the NFC South. The Saints should very much be in that mix.
And this isn't relevant to their offseason grade, but like Derek Carr in the second half of the season was a lot better than Derek Carr in the first half of the season. If it just took him half a year to kind of get, familiar with the offense and the system and the supported system, the players around him and all those kinds of things. Like if you're getting the second half of Derek Carr going forward, you're a better team than you were last year.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And sometimes season splits, you don't like to look into those too much, but if it's a player in a new system and a new environment, maybe there is some signal there and reason for optimism there for the Saints. We got to have a Reasons for Optimism show this offseason as well. New York Giants. We're going B+ here for the Giants from Trevor. Malik Neighbors, the flashiest of the offseason pickups as a 6th overall pick in the draft. They're going to lose Xavier McKinney and Saquon Barkley. By the way, they've got Hard Knocks the offseason here for the Giants. We're going to get into...
There's now three Hard Knocks per season.
This is the most interesting one because it's
depends what you see.
Probably.
Yeah.
Getting into the front office moves and some of their decisions and everything.
Right. It depends how much access you get this one.
But Brian Burns is in, traded for him. From the Carolina Panthers. So Burns comes in to play opposite Kayvon Thibodeau at edge. That's a big move. As I mentioned, Neighbors at receiver. And then the other news. And they've stitched it together on the offensive line. Jermaine Illuminor comes in to maybe play right tackle, push Evan Neal out. John Runyon, maybe a little too much for him to play right guard, $10 million a year. But anything is pretty much an upgrade right now for the Giants on the O-line.
Yeah, I mean, they've certainly invested in it. They bring in, those guys, Illuminor, John Runyon, Aaron Stinney as well on the interior. Like, they've at least added players that hopefully can try. It's the classic creep back toward average shot on the offensive line. Like, they've essentially looked at this and said, Andrew Thomas is good. Everybody else needs some kind of competition this offseason. Let's do that. And they've done it. So, when you're throwing that many darts at the offensive line, you can't do it with a high money, huge value. Like not each position is going to have a high quality replacement available anywhere. So you might have to overpay for a John Runyon or whatever. But adding the bodies is worth taking a shot at, given how bad that group was a year ago.
We'll see how well Malik Neighbors hits the ground running here. But between Neighbors and Darius Slayton still there, as a guy that's been a good vertical threat. Jalen Hyatt as a vertical threat. Wan'Dale Robinson kind of working out of the slot. See if they get anything out of Darren Waller at tight end. But
he might retire.
He might. There's a lot of questions there. Will this be the best supporting cast for Daniel Jones? I mean, it's probably the last year for Jones with the Giants. Daniel Jones has not been a carry-the-team type of starter. But, yes, we are 2 years removed from them overachieving and Jones putting together a pretty solid season because – and big part of what he did with his legs.
Yeah, I think it should be the best supporting cast he's had. They also signed the ghost of Allen Robinson as well. See if he can resuscitate anything from his career at this point. But yeah, this should be the best group of playmakers he's had to work with, even with Saquon Barkley no longer being there. The question really is how much of an impact is that offensive line overhaul going to have? Because if that's still a bad unit, I think Daniel Jones is a bad quarterback to have behind a bad offensive line. If the offensive line successfully creeps back toward average, then the playmaker group, I think, is now good enough that Daniel Jones can have a decent season, particularly if Darren Waller doesn't retire and actually decides to give it one last go-around. The Hard Knocks thing would be hilarious, though, if you just saw like an unfiltered conversation about Daniel Jones, It's like the episode one.
We're stuck with him one more year.
Episode 1 is just them sitting in a room debating whether this guy is actually worth keeping around or not, and ultimately they settle on, you know what? Our options aren't great. We're not going to be able to go in a different direction. Let's just give it to Daniel Jones for one more year, and then we can drop kick him out of the building.
It will be interesting if we get that insight on all the rumors that they were trying to trade up for Drake May. Yeah. And if you do get – because supposedly, and I think Daniel Jeremiah was reporting this, well, two things. First off, they brought in Drew Lock to potentially compete with Daniel Jones, legitimately.
Is that true, though?
That's supposedly, right? And then secondly – that they were saying we'll only draft a quarterback who's better than Daniel Jones / Drew Lock, and they felt like Drake May was the cutoff there. So if we do get more insight into those discussions.
Wait, what was our grade for their offseason?
B+.
I feel like that needs to be reduced by at least a whole letter grade simply because of the uniforms that they unveiled. Did you see this?
No.
Throwback uniforms. Throwback from the 1930s, which is always
the throwback should not go past the 60s. Man.
Yeah. So
there's got to be a cutoff here.
So this is a uniform that
what color? It's got to have stripes. I haven't seen it. It's got to have
stripes. It does have stripes. It also has khaki colored pants and the Michigan style helmet, with the wings and stuff.
Yeah.
It's not great. It's called a legacy uniform, I think.
Those like when the ones that the Packers used to wear all the time.
Century Red is what this is called for their 100th season commemorative uniform. Here we go. It's on the screen for your. There you go.
Oh, what?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So those pants, those aren't as bad, but those look like a little bit of what Iowa State played with last year.
Uh-huh.
Where if
the ones where they look naked?
Yes.
Yeah, that was bad.
These pants have the
potential. How did that get past? How did that get to the field? Like, did nobody at any point in the design process put that together and say, dude, you can't put them out there and like this? This is.
It was like when Orlovsky looked like he was in tighty whities with a certain angle with his khakis or whatever. That's what Iowa State looked like.
Yeah. No, these aren't that bad.
These have that potential. I'm just saying.
Maybe
certain players might look like they're.
It's
pantsless.
Possible, right? It could get there. I just think.
Yeah.
With those uniforms, I can't have higher than a C. Can't have it.
Those are.
Also, by the way, two of those players in the picture are getting fined for uniform violations. That's a sock violation.
Sock violation for
two of them. Thibodeau's good. He's
Was
fine.
that allowed in the 30s?
I don't know, but it's not allowed in today's NFL, so I can't have that. That guy's getting Daniel Jones and is that Andrew Thomas is getting fined $25,000.
Commissioner was cracking down on sock length in the 30s, I'm sure. All right, where are we going? New York Jets. Going for a B. Going with a B here for the Jets.
Going with a B.
Now, do you like what the Jets did this offseason?
Yes. Yeah, it did. Tyron
Smith. They're worse.
I didn't say they were necessarily worse. I said a large part of their offseason has to be viewing like the addition of Aaron Rodgers if you're getting him.
I've been guilty of this in the past. Looking at the name, looking at how good they play football, how well they play football, and ignoring the injury risk because it's hard to quantify, right? But if you do that, which I tend to do, Mike Williams coming in at receiver, Tyron Smith coming in at left tackle. I mean, they've made some moves. Now those are boomer bust types of guys, right? Getting Tyron Smith through a whole season, getting Mike Williams through a whole season. But if they're healthy and play, it has the potential to be a couple of the really good offseason moves, of course, with Aaron Rodgers coming back.
Yeah, my point, I think, that was perhaps slightly taken out of context last time around is that I think if you ignore Aaron Rodgers and you look at players 2 through 53 on the roster, it's not immediately clear that they're significantly better than they were a year ago because most of the additions came again against corresponding losses, right?
But if you do it unit by unit, like the offensive line as a unit certainly is in better shape than it was last year.
But like Hassan Reddick comes in, but Bryce Huff departs. Javon Kinlaw comes in, but John Franklin Myers departs. Like the defensive line as a totality might not be better than it was a year ago.
Yeah. So I think unit-wise, though, receiver's an upgrade. Offensive line is an upgrade. The trade for Morgan Moses, I'll do that all day, right? Mid-rounder to get Morgan Moses, who's been very dependable, solid. He's stayed healthy. He's kind of been the opposite of Tyron Smith as far as injuries go.
The big thing that I love from their offseason is the combination of solutions at left tackle, right? I was sort of pitching, I think, to the Jets, actually, that they should get Tyron Smith and then Josh Jones. Like, they should get both those guys for exactly the same reason, right? Tyron Smith should play, if he plays at a Pro Bowl / All-Pro level, right? One of the best left tackles in the NFL still. Having said that, he will probably miss time, and so you need some kind of capable backup option. My idea early in the offseason was Josh Jones, but Olu Fashanu, I think, is a better long-term play at that spot, and he could be a better short-term play than Josh Jones as well. So I love that combination. Like, I think that is the best thing that they've done this offseason is absolutely answer the issue at left tackle.
Yeah, I like the way they handled that. And did you see the video on Joe Douglas and the number of times he tried to trade up for Malachi Corley? I'm always fascinated by what leads to that. Is that simply because they loved him as a player, or did they get enamored with the skill set, the yards after the catch type of skill set, when you wanted a player like Malachi Corley so much in the draft, who they eventually get in the third round? Was that simply because, look, Mike Williams isn't a yards after the catch type of guy. Garrett Wilson's more of an all-around Stephon Diggs type of receiver. He's not a yak-centric guy, but Corley brings a complete different change of pace, screen guy, put him in the backfield, do all these different things, put the ball in his hands, and that's completely different from what everybody else has, and they had to have him. So interested to see how he fits in because the Jets really, really wanted him.
Yeah, and it's always like that always doesn't feel great to me when guys are so obsessed with particularly a day 3 player. It's like, I got to get this guy. I got to go trade.
It was day 2.
Was it day 2? When did they get him?
Early third round.
Third.
But they were trying to trade up as high as the mid-second. They were trying to get up for a while to get Corley.
It just, when you're outside of the first round, becoming that locked in on a guy always feels like a questionable process because of all those data points that we mentioned, that the chances are you're not any better at identifying the dude. So sure, take a swing at it, like try and get him if you like, but like becoming, and part of this is just that's the way that sort of video plays out, right? It's like you edit it together, you look at the number of times they try to trade out. It's the desperation that seems like is there might not really be how it was, but yeah, like it is a skill set that was sort of not quite missing. It's like Garrett Wilson is a really good yards after the catch receiver, but it is a different skill set than anybody else on this roster.
He's good at it, but he's just your do it all wide receiver 1. He's not your gadget player, so to speak.
And he's
right?
also
That's
he's not breaking tackles through power the way Corley is. Like Corley's going to run over people as much as run around them, whereas Garrett Wilson is very much a cut and leave you grasping at air type of yak guy.
This is where we'll see how it plays out, but that's where I tend to believe the teams focus a little bit too much on fit for those trade ups, and we'll see how that plays out. I want to explain too. You think Bryce Huff versus Hassan Reddick. Huff is a better snap for snap pass rusher than Reddick, but Reddick is probably more suited to play every down.
And Huff. I mean, he's proven that he's
right. So that's not. I don't know that it's Huff is better than Reddick. But snap for snap, Huff is going to be a more effective pass rusher, but Reddick's probably going to give you more.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I would say those two guys are a wash. One has been a better player on a per snap basis. One has played way more snaps and been more productive on a volume basis. So if we say that those two things equal out and it becomes a wash, then their defensive line moves becomes John Franklin Myers versus Javon Kinlaw, and Franklin Myers has been a way better player than Kinlaw. So it's a net loss.
I think their WAR was almost exactly the same last year. So the
Kinlaw
Eagles,
Franklin Myers?
Huff and Reddick.
Yeah.
So Eagles are the team that got Bryce Huff. We have an A for the Eagles offseason from Trevor, and I think this is warranted. You've got Fletcher Cox and Jason Kelsey retiring, so that's not necessarily their moves. They're going to see Bryce Huff come in to replace Hassan Reddick. Of course, we loved what the Eagles did in their draft as far as waiting and getting Quinyon Mitchell, getting Cooper DeJean. What are your thoughts on this Eagles offseason?
And another team where the most important things they did might have been the coaching moves.
For sure.
The last year, this time a year ago, they lost both coordinators, and it definitely felt like that had an impact probably on both sides of the ball last season. This offseason, they bring in Kellen Moore, who I think his sort of overall, like where he is exactly in the coaching pantheon is still a little bit fuzzy and a little bit open for debate, but at minimum, he's a perfectly good, capable offensive coach, right? Which wasn't necessarily the case a year ago. And then defense, they get Vic Fangio. Like, that's huge. I mean, his defense might be slightly fading now while Mike McDonald's is on the rise, but it's still, number one, a lot of teams in the NFL still running it. Number two, he's still the finest exponent of that defense. So they are bringing in a high-level defensive coach and at least a solid to good offensive coach in place of two coaching problems from a year ago.
They did bring in Devin White. We'll see how that fits in to that system there. Devontae Parker too. I think a sneaky good wide receiver 3 option here. There was times when it was.
That is now a fascinating linebacker room, by the way. Have you seen? We've got Nakobe Dean, who's still the great hope. Devin White. Jeremiah Trotter Jr., the legacy addition in the draft, and your guy Oren Burks.
My goodness. Well, Trotter's really my guy. But yeah, Oren Burks has been my guy for 9 years now.
Yeah.
For sure. But the receiving room of A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, and now Devontae Parker as a 3, just chuck some jump balls up to Devontae Parker as a 3, and you take a little – like Parker never really should have been – never played like a 1 or a 2, maybe a 2. But now as a 3, I think there's some potential there.
And the late round addition of Johnny Wilson as well could make some noise in that receiving room.
Just red zone options and size and difficult to cover options. So yeah, we loved the Eagles draft. We mentioned the two corners, or whatever you want to call Dijon, as a corner or safety, but they've got some backup options now for Darius Slay and James Bradbury, some versatility in Dijon. Will Shipley, a running back that you like, add him to the mix, and of course Saquon Barkley. Barkley, I know I've oversimplified in the past where you say, well, any running back's going to run well behind a good offensive line, but Barkley, I think, has never had good run blocking, never had a good situation. I think the best situation was when Daniel Jones was running a lot in 2022. But now you have Barkley with Jalen Hurts in this backfield. Saquon has that ability, if you block it up, not just to pick up 10 or 20, to pick up 50. He has big playability. And so Saquon Barkley in this fit for the Eagles, I think, is really, really nice.
The big thing for them is going to be, how much of a drop-off is there on the offensive line with the retirement of Jason Kelce. Cam Jurgens presumably steps in at center where he was expected to play coming into the NFL, and now you have therefore you have a hole at right guard. So if that combination is able to at least be fine, and then you've got Mailata, Lane Johnson reaching the end but still playing at a really high level, and Landon Dickerson at guard, that's three spots that should be above average, if not very, very good. And then the two question marks. Like if that nets out as still a very good offensive line, this group should be phenomenal on offense.
All right, we're on to the Pittsburgh Steelers, a B+ from Trevor for their offseason. As I've said a few different times here, I think their process and how they handled the quarterback situation, trading Kenny Pickett to the Eagles, and then signing Russell Wilson, pennies on the dollar, trading for Justin Fields for almost nothing draft-wise. Pretty good process given their starting point. Doesn't mean it's going to work out. Doesn't mean that they're going to have great play from Russell Wilson and or Justin Fields. But from what they started with and what they ended with and how much they invested in it, nice job there by the Steelers, and then opens up the ability to build the rest of the roster, which I think they've done a nice job of the last couple of years.
No, definitely. I think that those were good moves. That's as good as they could have done this offseason with the quarterback position. And let's be honest, whether it's Russell Wilson or Fields, they should be upgrades over. Like each one of those guys had a significantly better PFF grade than Kenny Pickett last season. Even if you just look at passing grade, Justin Fields was right there with Kenny Pickett, with the addition that he brings, a whole bunch of special ability on the ground. So either one of those guys should be a significant upgrade over Kenny Pickett, and it cost them very little to make that move, make either one of those moves. I mean, they're paying. Like Russell Wilson is counting, I think, less than $1 million or slightly over $1 million on their salary cap this year. So that's basically like a free player at the most important position in the NFL. And then Justin Fields cost them very little in terms of trade and is on the books for like $6 million. So very little invested in the most important position in the game, which should be an upgrade regardless of which player ends up starting for them this year. And then they did some work on particularly the offensive line. The only real sort of quibble or criticism would be trading away Deontay Johnson and then, whether that's a net win or not with Roman Wilson, the rookie, coming in and having to have a pretty significant role now to replace Johnson.
Yeah, so just to touch on the offensive line really quick, loved, 3 out of their first 5 picks were offensive linemen. Troy Fautanu, the tackle out of Washington, center Zach Frazier out of West Virginia. Fautanu probably starts at right tackle right away. That's where they're working him. Moves last year's first rounder Broderick Jones to left tackle. Zach Frazier steps in as a potential starting center right away. And then I loved Mason McCormick, the guard out of South Dakota State. I think he has starting potential down the line as well. So there's your culture play, right? Get back to the offensive line here for the Steelers. The question, though, as you mentioned, is wide receiver. They had been rolling 2, 3, 4 deep at the receiver the last few years, had done a nice job building that room. Now it's George Pickens. They've in a whole bunch of questions, right? Van Jefferson, Quez Watkins, Calvin Austin III, and then is that Roman Wilson as a third-round pick? Is he the best fit there? I think he probably is the best fit to take over for Deontay Johnson, but it's a lot of pressure, I think, for a rookie.
And it's a little bit like, we talked about Greg Roman and the Chargers earlier. The offensive system is going to be pivoting in a new direction. It's going to be probably less wide receiver needy than some other offensive systems would be. This offense now is moving to an Arthur Smith variant. You have George Pickens, who should be the clear number 1 guy there. The need at number 2 might not be as acute in this offense as it is in some systems. And so maybe a guy like Roman Wilson can step in and be the replacement for Deontay Johnson, and it's all fine.
So they brought in Patrick Queen at linebacker as well. They've been trying a whole bunch of different options at linebacker the last few years. My one question on Queen, If you look at his career grades, we have a 29.7
Yeah.
as a rookie, a 43.5. Then Mike McDonald takes over as defensive coordinator for the Ravens, and the 43 jumps up to a 69.7 and a 73 last year. Queen looked absolutely lost in his first 2 years. Now, is that just him getting better, developing, getting more experience, or was it because Mike McDonald's, playing to his strengths a little bit more? That's my one question about Queen, but certainly his career has been moving in the right direction these last couple seasons.
It also coincided quite neatly with the arrival of Roquan Smith in Baltimore.
And with
well.
Roquan,
so
for sure.
I think there's definitely question marks about what Patrick Queen looks like in this defense. Generally, this defense appears to be pivoting towards man coverage. I mean, they got rid of Patrick Peterson effectively because he can't play man coverage anymore. Joey Porter Jr. a year ago was a man coverage specialist. Dante Jackson, who they acquired this offseason, is better in man coverage than zone coverage. Patrick Queen theoretically gives you the man coverage ability to go one-on-one with athletes out of the backfield or a tight end. So this whole defense seems to be pivoting towards more of a focus on man coverage. That in and of itself is going to be interesting to watch.
I like a lot of what the Steelers have done, really, for 2 straight off seasons. We'll see if the low investment in the quarterback room, high investment in other places will end up paying off here.
Yeah, really good. I think a really good offseason, and I think you give them credit because, again, sort of it has to be versus expectation, right? With the Raiders, it was, is Gardner Minshew better or worse than the baseline expectation of what you could have done at quarterback? I think that was worse. I think for the Steelers, they are better than their baseline expectation given where they were heading into the offseason.
All right, San Francisco 49ers are up next. Trevor's giving them a C+ here. You got Eric Armstead out, Javon Kinlaw out on the defensive line. Armstead really the big one there. And just kind of filled things in with Leonard Floyd, Yetur Gross-Matos, both of those guys at edge, and then Jordan Elliott at defensive tackle. For me, the biggest win right now, though, is Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel are still on the roster.
Yeah.
It is one of those things that, like, no matter which way they go, I'm probably feeling good about it. You know what I mean? If they steal a first-round pick for one of those guys, knowing that you can't invest that heavily in that many players, I'm okay with that too. But right now, going into 24 and looking at what they have on the field, I mean, the 49ers roster is still looking really good.
Yeah, I'd love to know how serious any of those trade talks got or whether they were just rumors or rumblings, whether they were real or not. Because, yeah, keeping those guys intact and adding Ricky Pearsall in the first round, I mean, that it maintains and improves, enhances what is already maybe the most ridiculous skill position collection in the NFL when you take it in its totality with George Kittle and Christian McCaffrey and even Kyle Juszczyk as a fullback. It's such an insane group, and keeping it all together is huge for a team that wants to win a Super Bowl. But it would have been interesting to know, like, did they have offers on the table? Did they turn down a first-round pick to keep them both in place? Because that maybe changes your opinion on the whole thing. But overall, I think you got to look at it and say the offense is still in incredible shape. Offensive line is still a little bit of a question on paper, but it looks worse than I think the reality of it or the impact of it is. Like last season, it was a weakness on paper all the way through the season. But the number of games the weakness on paper became a problem on the field is fairly minimal. So maybe they're taking that approach, and maybe this is a Shanahan tree approach generally. Like Miami appears to not give that much of a crap how bad the offensive line looks on paper because with all those fast guys and with Tua getting the ball out quickly, it doesn't make that much of a difference. Maybe Shanahan himself, Kyle, is aware that, yeah, I would like a better offensive line. I do, however, know that I make the group look better with the system and that I kind of minimize the problems.
There's also the element of they all played last year, and it's this position where O-line, as an O-line keynote speaker and expert here, cool clinic weekend here.
Yeah.
I'm going to highlight how offensive linemen do take 2, 3, 4 years to develop. And Jake Brendel at center has developed into at least an average center, and Colton McKivitz at right tackle, at least an average-ish type of right tackle. That probably is good enough there. I think my bigger question, so 2 things here. You mentioned the Steelers may be playing more man coverage. It looks like the Niners might be as well. Second-round pick Renardo Green out of Florida State, Rocky Sin. Like those guys are more man coverage type of corners. So that cornerback spot opposite Javarius Ward, who's a very good man corner. You've got those options there. And then, by the way, Dominic Pooney, when we're talking offensive line, he has a chance to play guard and give them some depth there. And then my question is on the defensive line. So not that Javon Kinlaw was great, but he had some flashes last year. But losing Armstead might hurt.
Sure.
With Leonard Floyd not, playing as well as he has in recent years. I don't know that they're rolling 7 and 8 deep the same way they have on the defensive line. So that's just something else to keep an eye on here for the Niners. Are they relying too much on Nick Bosa? Last year they looked so loaded because they brought in Chase Young and brought in Randy Gregory, and all those guys are gone. So what looked like this loaded defensive line that they had on their run to the Super Bowl, much depleted compared to where it was last year.
Yeah, I mean, you look at their recent drafts, and they've kind of been absent, these guys coming in and making a big difference for a couple of drafts now. Obviously, Brock Purdy is papering over all of that, right? Because they've got literally the best value contract in football in a high-level quarterback playing on the Mr. Irrelevant deal. But, guys like Drake Jackson, who I really liked coming out as a situational pass rusher, has not become that guy. And even if he was only a situational pass rusher for them, but like a good one, it would be huge, and yet they haven't hit on him, so they have to go to the Leonard Floyd well, and try and bring in somebody like that to add something next to or opposite Nick Bosa. But you're right, like that. I mean, Javon Hargrave is great, Nick Bosa is great. Everybody else in that group,
they feel like they'll still be players though, right? In the veteran defensive line market here. But right now, it definitely looks like it's less on paper than they've had over the last few years.
Right.
All right, a few more teams here, Sam. Seattle Seahawks B+ this offseason from Trevor. Of course, the biggest move is Pete Carroll moving on, mutually parting ways even between Pete Carroll and the Seahawks. Sometimes that's the report. You just mutually part ways, and there's deeper stuff going on, but who knows?
Right.
But Mike Macdonald's going to take over in Seattle, as we talked about the Ravens hours ago being depleted. Coaching staff and front office. McDonald goes to Seattle. What are your thoughts on the Seahawks offseason?
Yeah, it's not like it's a continuity hiring, but in a number of ways, McDonald, I think, is similar to Pete Carroll as what he brings to the table, like bringing in a defensive philosophy that should be one of the best. Like Pete Carroll's defense that set the tone for the NFL for a number of years. It was the defense everyone was trying to copy for a while. McDonald's, I think, is about to become that. So that from that point of view, it's maybe, let's call it a sideways move until we see, what that's actually going to look like. But I don't hate the idea necessarily. I think it's like if the mutual parting of ways was in fact, a bye-bye, Pete, it's time to move. I don't know that I love it that much, but it did make some sense if it was just time and let's go and get a guy like Mike Macdonald when he's available. But it's certainly a seismic move for them. But I think Mike Macdonald was one of the hottest coaching hires in the offseason. He's going to bring in the right defensive scheme to add to this group. So that should help. And their offense was already, I think, in a pretty good spot. So
they had some issues on the offensive line. I liked what they did in the draft, needing a guard, waiting till the third round. Christian Haynes from UConn. Again, this is me liking the player and thinking he can step in and be a starter right away, and I think he can.
And he probably needs to.
And
they might still need to be players in the veteran, emergency free agent pool before the season starts.
The move to question before you get into the offseason, trading a second-round pick for Leonard Williams and paying him over $20 million a year. Leonard Williams is a very good player, one of the most dependable players in the NFL. You're going to get your 750 to 900 snaps from him every year. Good, solid run defender, good, solid pass rusher. The only question is that an overpay? Like when you get to draft night and you're like, man, we could have had a second-round pick here. However, Byron Murphy II, you get him in the first round.
Yep.
When Leonard Williams is there and you've got that dependability I talked about, you add Byron Murphy, you have Jaron Reed there. Jonathan Hankins comes in. He's always had those great on-off splits in the run game. It does look like the defensive line, Draymond Jones too, defensive line looking a lot better than it has in years past. So I think that's trending in the right direction for Seattle.
And a lot more versatile. I mean, this is part of the Mike Macdonald thing is now you have to start looking at these guys in a slightly different light and the versatility that some of these players bring. I mean, Leonard Williams has always been that versatile defensive lineman. Byron Murphy is that type of defensive lineman coming out of Texas. Like suddenly these versatile defensive linemen could be kind of turbocharged in what they can achieve on the field because of this Macdonald defense. So I like their defensive line or defensive front as a collection specifically within the context of this new defense.
B+ fair for Seattle?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's still some question marks there, but when you consider what the expectation was, they've lost some bigger names, but not necessarily impact players anymore. I mean, Bobby Wagner, at his best, is maybe the best linebacker of his generation, but he's not at his best anymore.
Right.
And it's probably the right time to move on. Jordan Brooks, I don't think it ever become the player that they expected him to be. Damian Lewis is fine, but it's not, if I would have potentially let him walk for the contract he was going to sign. The big question just remains, like, the interior of that offensive line. Can they put that together before the season?
All right, Tampa Bay Bucks. Trevor going with an A for his Bucks. If we go back to the starting point here, Baker Mayfield was unsigned. Mike Evans was unsigned. They bring both of those guys back. They bring back Levante David, and they just paid Antoine Winfield Jr., franchised him first, but then just paid him a record deal at safety. Out the door, though, Shaq Barrett at edge, Devin White at linebacker, and then traded Carlton Davis. And then I thought the draft for the Bucks, first 5 draft picks all look like instant contributors. So, yeah, for a team that on paper had a lot of question marks, right? You might have assumed that Baker Mayfield was going to be back and assumed that Mike Evans was going to be back, but they took care of that. And then you can see the draft up on the screen there. Graham Barton can step right in at center. Chris Braswell at edge. Tyke Smith, safety out of Georgia. They have roles to play as rookies. Jalen McMillan can be wide receiver 3 or at least compete there right away. And Bucky Irving as a change of pace running back. I think there's a lot to like about this Bucs offseason.
Yeah, I mean, as Trevor put it in the article, they kept who they wanted to keep. I think that's an achievement. They had Baker Mayfield, Mike Evans, Levante David, and Antoine Winfield Jr. got his big payday and was kept around. Those are 4 keystone players for this team. And even if Levante David is reaching the end of his career, I mean, he's still a really important part of that team. So keeping those guys around, if they wanted to keep all 4 of those guys, if that was all they did, it was an achievement. Shaq Barrett, has some injuries and hasn't been the player that he used to be. Devin White just has never been the player that he was supposed to be. And then trading away Carlton Davis, I mean, Carlton Davis has been a pretty solid player for them, but trading him away obviously suggests they were perfectly fine with losing him. So, I think they did a good job of keeping the important players on that roster that they could have lost a lot of. And certainly if they'd managed to lose, Baker Mayfield, who knows what they would have done at quarterback. That's good business. And then you end up with the draft, which has been, a pretty solid draft.
Yeah, so, I mean, given their starting point, as I said, I think the Bucs did a good job. The question's going to be, okay, did they just to make all these moves, is that just to once again compete in the NFC South? They won the division last year, but it wasn't like it was a cakewalk. I mean, they started out like 2-7, whatever it was, finished out strong. Does Baker Mayfield's big season last year coincide with Dave Canales? Was it that, or was it the fact that he did have Mike Evans and Chris Godwin to throw to, and they found that good chemistry? So they still have plenty of question marks there, and
Sure.
the question mark of, they finished in the final 8 of teams last year because they won their one playoff. They won a playoff game, go to the divisional round. Is there going to be this get over the hump next question with Baker Mayfield and what they have there? But look, keeping a pretty good nucleus around. Still have some questions about how well they're going to rush the passer with Barrett out and some of the guys that they have there. But and cornerback too, right? With Carlton Davis out, it was Davis and Jamel Dean for a few years there as a very good 1-2 tandem there. I got some questions about replacing Carlton Davis there because they never really answered that in the draft or free agency.
I mean, I think A is a stretch in terms of grade for their offseason, but I think this was solid given the potential losses that they could have incurred. But because they focused so much on bringing all those guys back, it's like, well, we didn't make that many additions that they're going to move the needle. I mean, obviously the draft is how you want to do that generally anyway, but you do still have this gaping hole at potentially one cornerback spot opposite Jamel Dean. You have some real weaknesses on this roster still. They didn't necessarily propel themselves forward as much as just maintain still being able to probably contend in a weak division.
All right, let's go Tennessee Titans. Trevor's given them a B. Now, I think it depends on your perspective here. There's a potential here for the Titans. I know there's a lot of investment in cornerback especially, but a lot of splashy plays here for the Titans. I think they certainly got better this offseason.
Yeah, and it's another one where it depends what you think of the coaching deal, right? Firing Mike Vrabel was surprising to a lot of people. I don't think that changes just because Mike Vrabel didn't get hired immediately in the cycle. So that as your sort of starting point is, do you agree or disagree with getting rid of Mike Vrabel as the head coach? Once you get beyond that, though, I think overall it's definitely a net positive. You can quibble on individual deals or individual players. I mean, Calvin Ridley was signed to very rich money given the season that he's just come off. But last year it was basically Nuke Hopkins, and that's it. That's what you had on offense. Now you've got Nuke Hopkins and Calvin Ridley and Tyler Boyd and Tony Pollard coming out of the backfield along with Tajee Spears. They've definitely upgraded that position.
It feels good to me for this year, I think. I mean, if we're sitting here a year from now and Nuke Hopkins he's getting older, he's in the last year of his deal, and Ridley's making his $23 million a year, and he's, all right, Ridley's our wide receiver 1, and you don't have someone above him, it doesn't feel as great. But I think Hopkins can still be a low-end number 1 wide receiver. Ridley's best as a 2. Tyler Boyd is good as a 3. You've given some pass-catching options to Will Levis. And then, with Brian Callahan coming in, I think the thing I like about Callahan was, when he was in with the Bengals, we've seen the Bengals offense evolve a lot through the years, right? Run the ball, under center, out of the gun, have to combat too high. All these different adjustments that the league made, the Bengals seem to do a good job of adjusting. Brian Callahan was a big part of that. And then he brings his dad, Bill Callahan, bringing his dad along to help solidify one of the worst offensive lines in the NFL, bring in J.C. Latham, flipping him to left tackle. They have a chance to improve on the offensive line as well. So I think there's a lot of those things. Plus, again, on the defensive side of the ball, L'Jarius Sneed and Chidobe Awuzie coming over at corner.
Yeah, huge addition. Yeah, Sneed in particular. And they also brought in Lloyd Cushenberry in the offensive line as well. So they've taken a few swings at that offensive line. Again, it was coming from such a low ebb. It's still got some question marks. I don't know that they're necessarily completely out on Nicolas Petit-Frere becoming the guy at right tackle. It's a stretch given what we've seen from him so far, but it's at least plausible that he could be.
I'll admit, I don't know if we could throw their offseason additions back up on the screen, but I will admit, historically, this is one of those free agent runs that we look at and say, oh, of course, they did a great job. And it doesn't always work out because, especially not over time. Like decent money for Tony Pollard at running back, big money for Lloyd Cushenberry at center.
Yeah.
Pretty big money for Awuzie at corner. We know that huge money at L'Jarius Sneed at corner after, trading a third rounder for him. So there's a lot, and huge money for Calvin Ridley.
Right. I mean, there's a higher than average level of question marks or concerns about the players that they've invested heavily in coming in to fix these. So, even if they brought in a lot of good players that should be upgrades, there's sort of an unusual volume of red flags attached to those players than you normally get.
All right, let's wrap it up with the Washington Commanders. I think we've got everybody. I think this is all 32, and if we miss somebody, sorry, we're not going back.
I have time to go back.
No going back here. But Trevor's given an A to the Washington Commanders. I mean, contrast this to what the Titans did. It's high volume, but at cheaper prices, right? You've got Austin Eckler at running back, cheaper, and Frankie Louvu as a good, solid addition who's been a very good hybrid linebacker type of edge player. I mean, it's a high volume additions here from Washington, and then I really liked what they did in the draft.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those it's one of those off seasons where there's so much turnover that it's almost impossible not to find enough things that you like about it to call it good. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
If you just throw that many darts at the board, you're going to be like, look, I hit a couple of bullseyes. I hit some big scores here. So, and again, another team where the whole thing starts with complete regime change, right? Adam Peters coming in as general manager, and then the new coaching staff with Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury and all those kinds of things. Another one where doesn't feel like it was the plan A. Dan Quinn might not have even been plan B or C, but we got a guy eventually. So that starts off.
I don't know if that's true.
I mean, but that probably starts off how you view the whole offseason, and then just that volume of turnover. Obviously, the single most important thing being the selection of Jaden Daniels as their quarterback.
Jaden Daniels, a quarterback. It wasn't like what you just described with hours ago. The Broncos, right? It's QB6. We just got to take somebody. I mean, the Commanders other than Caleb Williams, they had their pick. So they go Jaden Daniels. So a lot of this will depend on him. But I also loved what they did in the other parts of the draft, getting Johnny Newton as a best player available. Don't need a defensive tackle, but they took him in the second round, a first-round caliber player. Mike Sanders still the corner out of Michigan there, and Ben Sinnott, the tight end out of Kansas State. It just really good, best player available type of picks in the draft to go with. hey, bringing in Tyler Biadasz as a starting center where you needed some bodies on the offensive line to get that thing moving forward. So I think there's a lot to like about Washington. Maybe not, I don't know how much we're going to feel this season as far as
it's just,
them turning it around. But I think culture change, personnel changes, but not massive investment that's going to hurt you in the future. So I think Washington's put themselves in a good position for 2025 and 26.
It's such a turnover. Like, it's such a complete and total churn of everything. The coaching staff, the front office, the roster, the quarterback, the infrastructure, everything. It's such a turnover. It's almost impossible to know what it's going to do year one, right? It could be complete and total change, and this team looks amazing right out of the gate because they changed everything, and it's all having a positive impact. Or it can be like they don't look much better at all, and it's just so, like, it's going to take some time for it to all come together. Like, obviously the Jaden Daniels thing is huge. Jaden Daniels and Cliff Kingsbury's offense is going to be interesting. We don't even know what Kingsbury's offense is going to look like after his sort of time away from the game to figure out where his offense stagnated and went off the rails a little bit. The big concern on draft night, and continue to be a concern as the draft went on, is have they got enough on the offensive line? Daniels is great. The receivers look good. Have we got enough to make that all work, right? Because
it's a couple swing tackles out there. Andrew Wiley, Cornelius Lucas.
I mean, 4 out of the 5 starters are guys that if they were your worst offensive lineman, you'd feel good. But if they're 4 of your 5 starters, you don't feel great about it. And even the 5th, Sam Cosmi, last year was like his first year playing, at guard, really. And he played well, but like it's not necessarily a given he's going to be at that standard every year.
Yeah, definitely still some questions there, but I think, like you said, there's so much turnover. I think they're pointed in the right direction there. Looking forward to seeing that. I just don't know I don't know how much they improve in year one unless Jaden Daniels is just a star right away.
Amazing.
Right.
Yeah, or if the combination of him and that offense is phenomenal. But I think Adam Peters was a good hiring. I think, generally speaking, poaching from really well-run organizations is probably a good approach. So that, I think, was a good signing. The Dan Quinn thing, I mean, I think he'll be a better head coach now than he was the first time around. He was pretty good the first time around.
Yeah.
Albeit with an amazing staff underneath him, which might not have this time around. But Dan Quinn was probably a solid hiring, even if he was their second, third, whatever choice. And then Jaden Daniels, it's going to come down to, how much is last year for real, or was that his high watermark, and actually the concerns are bigger than people think.
Is this the longest show we've ever done?
It's one of them.
Good work, man.
It did occur to me that this is why it was one of the best performing episodes last year. It was one of the longest.
We did it. We made it through. I can't believe you said, well, we're going to touch on every team.
We did, didn't we?
It's the fastest we can go.
It all took was 6 hours.
Good work, though. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. We'll be back again on Monday. I think we've got the watch-along set up for Monday. I think we're gonna watch an old draft on Monday, 2011 NFL draft. I'm looking forward to it.
That's a fun one, at least.
Yeah, it's a fun one. We'll have some fun with it. So, again, email us, give us your thoughts on the offseason, things we can do, NFLpodcast@pff.com. And that's it for us today. 32 off-seasons graded. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll see you again on Monday with more PFF NFL Podcast.